The greatest cover-up in human history was not hidden in a secret vault or written in a classified document. It was carved into clay, whispered in myth, and buried beneath thousands of years of revisions. That is, until modern astronomy accidentally rediscovered it. Throughout history, the world's oldest civilizations told the same impossible story, that humanity did not rise alone, that our creators came from the sky, and that their world would one day return. For more than 6,000 years, our ancestors whispered the same forbidden truth in tablets, myths, and star maps, a truth so dangerous that kings erased it, religions buried it, and modern governments still deny it. A truth that suggests our solar system is incomplete, that something enormous, something intelligent is moving out there in the dark. What if the ancients weren't imagining gods? What if they were reporting a recurring event that nearly wiped them out? A world with an orbit so vast it disappears into deep space for thousands of years, only to swing back through the inner solar system like a cosmic executioner. A world they called Nibiru. The Sumerians said it housed beings older than every kingdom on Earth, the ANUNNAKI, flesh and blood visitors who engineered early humans not as children of the gods, but as a working species, crafted for labour in mines that predate all recorded civilization. It sounds impossible, until you realise that the same orbital period the ancients wrote about is now being modelled by astronomers searching for the mysterious Planet 9, a massive hidden object whose gravity is warping everything around it. For decades, NASA has denied the existence of such a world, but the anomalies are growing. Kuiper Belt objects bending toward an invisible giant, orbital tilts no known planet can explain, and a series of strange mistakes and retractions from past space missions that look less like scientific corrections and more like damage control. Even more disturbing are the deaths, the missing data, the sudden silences of researchers who got too close. And beneath it all lurks the oldest and most terrifying question humans have ever asked. What happens when our creators come back? And what if they didn't leave as benevolent gods, but as rulers expecting their property to still be in order? Tonight, we step into the forbidden story that connects ancient creation myths, the Enuma Elish, the Sumerian king list, Planet 9 mathematics, government secrecy, deep underground bases, and the terrifying possibility that a returning celestial body has shaped every collapse, every flood, every civilizational reboot in our species' past. This is not just mythology, it is a pattern, a cycle, a countdown. And according to both ancient timelines and modern orbital models, its next chapter is not far away. Brace yourself, because what you're about to hear tonight is the story we were never meant to piece together, and once you understand it, the sky will never look the same again. Meet the man who looked at broken clay and said it wasn't poetry, it was a briefing. Zechariah Sitchin claimed those wedges pressed into wet tablets weren't parables for children, but classified documents from humanity's real creators, records that slipped through time disguised as myth. He did not come from the gate-kept halls where careers are built on footnotes and peer circles. He came from economics and journalism, trained to follow patterns, track motives, and question official stories. That outsider angle mattered. He wasn't trying to win tenure, he was trying to solve a case. When he read Akkadian and Sumerian inscriptions, he didn't see winged gods floating in dreamland. He saw logistics, metallurgy, and project management. He saw a supply chain. Sitchin's method was blunt. Treat the tablets as eyewitness testimony. Take gods as beings. Take their boats of heaven as craft. Follow the references to metals and measurements. Follow the work rosters. Follow the grievances. He argued that the storytellers were archivists who dated shipments, counted loads, and logged interventions. Where scholars saw metaphorical heavens, he saw orbits. Where others saw sacred gardens, he saw fenced zones under quarantine, access restricted. And because he was not bound by the guild's dictionaries, he felt free to reassign meanings where context seemed technological. He built a picture piece by piece, like an auditor reconstructing a lost ledger. At the core of his claim sat a blunt proposal. The Anunnaki were physical extraterrestrials. They came for a material reason, gold, and they engineered a workforce because they were stretched thin and facing a crisis at home. Not angels, not spirits, bodies with needs, command structures, rotations, labour disputes. He said the first workers they brought mutinied in the mines after long cycles underground, conditions he mapped onto notes about toil, fatigue, and pleas to the overseeing lords. The solution arrived in a lab, not a temple. Combine a native hominin with a controlled infusion of their own blueprint. Start with prototypes, fail, correct, iterate, then scale. If that reading is right, the ground under our feet tilts. Humanity becomes not chosen or random, but assigned, designed to fit a task. Our myths become memos from management. Our origins become an industrial workaround. The idea is cold and efficient. Create helpers who can breathe the air, carry loads, and obey the dignity of a long evolutionary arc reappears, but under new lighting. Refinement not by nature alone, but by selective update. He pointed to lines about mixing clay with divine essence, about wombs and births, and said those phrases belonged in a lab notebook. In his telling, we learned language under direction, received agriculture by instruction, and were given how-to manuals disguised as rituals. From there he started retuning the old stories. The Garden of Eden becomes a restricted biosphere managed by a factional team. Enki and Enlil are not abstract dualities, but rivals with competing policies about human access and autonomy. One risks bending protocols to help the new species flourish. The other disciplines, erases, resets. The flood is not a fairy tale, but a strategic non-intervention during a known celestial passage, with a quiet warning leaked to a chosen survivor as an act of defiance. He mapped names, actions and locations across tablets and later literature, showing how motifs persisted as they moved from Sumer to Akkad to Babylon to biblical redactions. Every altar mask hides a maintenance manual. This story did not land gently in academic circles. The backlash was loud and fast. Linguists argued his readings collided with established grammar and context. A Sirologist said he cherry-picked glosses, lifted words out of ritual frames, then pasted in modern hardware. They pushed a simple counter. Anunnaki means the high-ranking deities in the pantheon full stop. Nibiru, they said, is Akkadian and translates to a crossing point in the sky, often used in reference to Jupiter in certain positions. They accused him of flattening a poetic, multivalent system into a single technological timeline. Yet the intensity of the response surprised even observers. Panels, essays, and public campaigns to mark his work as pseudo. If he was only wrong, why mobilize? That question fueled a second layer. Maybe the resistance was about more than quality control. He had wandered into territory that touches living institutions, religion, governance, and the intellectual monopoly over texts that define identity. If ancient records were field reports, then control over translation is control over origin. The thought unsettled people, and it grew a shadow. What if Sitchin wasn't just a brash reader, but a messenger? Some suggested he was a whistleblower who slipped forbidden knowledge into trade press because academic gates would never open. Others suspected the reverse, that he served as a controlled asset, delivering a partial truth to acclimate the public, framed in ways that could be dismissed if the timing wasn't right. The speculation deepened when readers noticed strange alignments between his narrative and long-running esoteric teachings. Hermetic texts talk about as above, so below, the map of the heavens mirrored in human bodies and states, Kabbalistic diagrams organize creation through emanations, hierarchies, and interventions. Occult traditions encode serpents, wings, and discs as power diagrams and initiatory maps. Sitchin's world is crowded with winged discs, serpentine knowledge and ranked councils. Critics called that appropriation. Supporters called it corroboration. He traced elite bloodlines and priestly roles across ages. Initiatory orders do that too. Either he raided their symbol vaults, or they all drank from the same old river. The overlap raises a hard problem. If symbols from mystery schools match his claimed history, did he crack a code that occult societies preserved under metaphor? Or did he retrofit their symbols onto random fragments to build a grand tableau? Some point to moments where his readings anticipate discussions that later seeped into mainstream anthropology. Culture as technology transfer, temples as knowledge banks, myths as compressed instruction sets. Others note that he fixed on Nibiru as a proper world even though the term is Akkadian and flexible, not a Sumerian home address. That linguistic snag undercuts his flagship claim, while leaving his broader pattern hunting intact. He also built his case on motive. Gold for atmosphere repair, he said, was the practical reason behind the first mission. That's a specific claim with a specific physics. If your world's sky is thinning, atomized metals might reflect or stabilize. He pointed to the obsessive ancient interest in gold's incorruptibility, its ritual use, and its cosmic associations. In his framing, the metal's sacredness is downstream from scarcity and utility. Those who controlled the flow controlled the planet. Then the Agigi mutiny, workers breaking under long cycles, forces a pivot to genetic intervention. Human purpose becomes a byproduct of crisis management. The ethical fallout is heavy. If we were engineered, consent didn't factor. If factions disagreed about our treatment, then our moral frameworks may descend from a family feud we barely understand. One figure guards, teaches, and bends rules. Another enforces, edits, and punishes. Sitchin read every catastrophe as the echo of that splitter grant of knowledge here. A ban there, a reset when the experiment escapes its intended boundary. Even the idea of a lifespan limit, kings and patriarchs living centuries, then a shortening, can be read as policy, not fate. He connected these arcs to cycles, to returns, to a long timeline measured not in human reigns but in orbital loops. The institutional response hardened over time. Not only linguists, but archaeologists, historians and astronomers took public positions. He was accused of rearranging syllables and lifting passages into modern frames. Yet the popularity of his books grew because he made things coherent for people who sensed gaps in official stories. He gave a motive, a blueprint, and actors with names. He mapped temples to workshops, sacrifices to contracts, and commandments to instructions. He treated priestly titles as job descriptions. To a public already wary of gatekeepers, that approach felt honest. It said the world is run like a company, and we are stakeholders kept out of the boardroom. Then the Whisper networks added another layer, ties to Freemasonic and esoteric currents. Whether or not he bore any lodge credentials, his emphasis on elite lineages, sacred geometry in city plans, and encoded wisdom in myths mirrored themes long guarded in initiatory circles. It made some readers think he had access to inner libraries. It made critics say he wore a costume stitched from other people's symbols. Either way, the echo exists. Winged discs hang over Sumerian kings and lodge tracing boards alike. Serpent circle staffs in both temples and apothecaries. The same motifs persist, and his story gives them a literal spine. So we sit in a forked path. If his translations approximate truth, then our species' history includes an intervention we barely remember, and the tablets are not literature but testimony. If his work is a guided narrative, then we are being warmed to an idea piece by piece, while the unprintable parts are kept off stage. Both routes converge on a single unease. Someone somewhere knows more than we do, and that knowledge shapes policy. He either decoded a record or delivered a rehearsal. Either way, origin is not neutral, it carries instructions. There's one more thread he tugged that changes how we read the oldest stories. When gods fight in the sky, maybe we're not hearing allegory, maybe we're hearing collision. In his reading, the War of the Gods becomes a physical event written in the architecture of the solar system. A rogue world enters. Forces tear at a water-rich planet. Fragments scatter. A remnant becomes the world we stand on. That would mean our oldest epics preserve stress reports from a catastrophe we still measure in craters and angles. If the gods were bodies with gravity, their battles would leave debris fields. And if that is where the record points, the next chapter isn't ritual, it's impact. Start with the clay, but hear the physics beneath it. The Enuma Elish reads like myth, yet its bones look like an incident report. Fragmented lines about gods clashing and skies torn open can be read as the memory of an event so large it carved patterns into orbits and left scars on worlds. If the epic holds a blurred record of a real upheaval, then it describes not a divine quarrel, but the violent engineering of the solar system we live in. In that frame, Tiamat is not a serpent of the sea. She's a planet that once circled the sun between Mars and Jupiter. Swathed in deep oceans and wrapped in heavy clouds, Sitchin's reading gives her mass, water and chemistry. Think of a world with a thick hydrosphere and a crust under stress, forming early when the system was crowded. In this view, her orbit sat where the asteroid belt lies today, in a gravitational tug-of-war with Jupiter's pull. Complex molecules drifted in her air and pooled in her seas. This is the stage before the drama, a quiet configuration that would not last. Then comes Marduk, not as a god but as a body on a hostile trajectory. Nibiru, entering on a retrograde path, cuts across the lanes of the young planets. Its orbit counters the traffic of the solar system, creating enormous differential velocities. Long before any impact, gravity does the work. The intruder's mass sends ripples across space. Perturbations stack and repeat, like a rhythm imposed on an orchestra already playing. The orbits of smaller bodies begin to precess. The timing of conjunctions changes. Resonances lock, then snap. The first encounter is all tide and torque. When two massive bodies pass close, their gravity stretches each other into ovals. If Tiamat was water-rich, the effect magnifies. Oceans rise not by feet, but by miles, then fall with the timing of the flyby. Crust flexes, faults open, and the released energy becomes heat. Sitchin's winds of Marduk, the moons of the intruder, sweep ahead and behind it. Each one adds local fields and pulls material out into space. Debris fans outward on new paths, turning quiet regions into meteor swarms. Some fragments spiral inward to the sun, others are thrown outward into elongated arcs. You can narrate the dynamics in modern terms. As Nibiru crosses Tiamat's neighbourhood, tidal bulges shift the smaller world's mass distribution that offset feeds back into its spin and orbit. Angular momentum trades hands. If the intruder carries multiple moons, their hill spheres briefly overlap with Tiamat's, and captured fragments can be stripped or injected. A grazing pass may shear off the upper crust, exposing mantle, and flash vaporize ocean water into a plume that escapes and recondenses as icy grains far from the sun. This would seed long-period comet reservoirs with hydrated material. Collision physics bridges the ancient lines and the mechanics. When a large body intrudes, three outcomes compete: merger, fragmentation, or deflection with mass exchange. The energy release depends on impact angle and relative speed. A shallow, sweeping strike can peel layers from a planet like a lathe. A deeper blow can shatter it into families of fragments that keep orbital memory spin states change, axial tilts wobble, and satellite systems can be erased or rebuilt. Atmospheres can be stripped if shockwaves exceed escape velocity, leaving bare rock in place of cloud. The Enuma Elish speaks of a second confrontation, and Sitchin places the decisive blow on the next pass. The first encounter leaves Tiamat fractured and leaking. The next one delivers the break. In this scenario, Nibiru returns with the geometry needed to intersect the wounded path. Its body, or one of its largest moons, connects center mass with Tiamat's weakened core. The outcome is catastrophic. The world splits. One great shard, still carrying oceans and a remnant atmosphere, is pushed inward on a new, tighter orbit. Another vast field of fragments remains near the original lane. This is where the hammered bracelet takes form. A ring of rubble persists between Mars and Jupiter. Not a neat ring, but a wide band of varied sizes on resonant paths shaped by Jupiter's pull. In the story, that field comes from Tiamat's broken half, ground into a belt that never reassembles. If so, it would hold a mix of rock, metal and ice. Reminders of the world that was smaller shards on high inclination or eccentric orbits become the long-period wanderers. The system gains a new hazard and a new map. The inward shard becomes the world we stand on. Its inherited water fills a basin so large it looks like a wound that never fully healed. The crust cools and stitches itself, but the distribution of continents and oceans keeps the asymmetry of birth. The axial tilt reflects the torque of the blow. Seasons appear, not as a gentle feature but as a side effect of trauma. You can follow how such a world would capture heat, circulate air, and drive a unique climate engine shaped by an uneven surface and a moon that stabilizes its wobble. Kingu in this telling was Tiamat's primary moon, large, close, and bound. When the break happens, Kingu finds itself pulled along with the inward shard. It ends up circling the newborn Earth, stripped of much of its volatiles by the heat of the event. Its density and isotopic fingerprint resemble Earth's outer layers. Because it formed from similar material, its orbit starts close and migrates outward as tidal interactions transfer energy. It locks one face toward Earth and becomes the anchor that damps chaotic tilts and protects nascent climate bands from wild swings. These details echo a modern model, a giant impact creating Earth's moon from debris. The mainstream version names the impactor Theia and places the collision in the Hadean era. Sitchin's version names Tiamat and Nibiru and sets a broader system-wide catastrophe. The overlap lies in the physics of large body collisions and the evidence etched into lunar rock: impact melt, anorthositic crust, and an oxygen isotope ratio nearly identical to Earth's mantle. Our moon bears the marks of trauma, its far side's thicker crust, the maria that filled basins with basalt after titanic strikes, and the lack of a large iron core all speak to a violent origin. If myth remembers collision, we should expect the solar system to carry other fingerprints. The tilt of Uranus, the retrograde spin of Venus, the odd distribution of angular momentum, and families of asteroids sharing elements of orbit could all be aftershocks in orbital space. Even without adopting every detail of Sitchin's map, modern dynamics accepts that early planetary systems experienced heavy bombardment, migration, and giant impacts. Disks produce worlds, worlds scatter, and a few survive. Critics point to problems: splitting a planet cleanly and sending half inward onto a stable, near-circular orbit strains mechanics. The energy would tend to disperse material, not preserve a neat half. The asteroid belt's diversity looks more like primordial leftovers sculpted by Jupiter than shards from a single water-rich parent. Yet the question lingers beneath those objections. Could a cultural memory preserve elements of violent events without technical terms? If the Earth and Moon formed in a cataclysm, the shock waves would be literal and cultural. Survivors would encode what they could. Sky turned bright at the wrong time, fire falling, seas surging, day length changing, a new light in the night. Read the ancient lines as a blend of fear and description. Winds become moons or gravitational wakes. Net becomes a ring of debris. Opening Tiamat's belly sounds like breaching a crust and letting oceans pour into space. Hammered bracelet suggests a belt of stones. The metaphors map to mechanics because humans tend to fix unknowns using familiar language. Over generations, ritual recitation keeps the structure even as details blur. By the time scribes press wedges into clay, the science is gone, but the sequence remains. Approach, first damage, return, shattering, rearrangement. Take the timeline seriously and the story rearranges our map. Earth is not a quiet core that cooled in place. It's a survivor that owes its oceans to a different world. The moon is not a captured outsider, but a remnant left in tow after a break. The belt is not a failed planet's seedbed, but a graveyard. The gods are not metaphors for weather. They are names given to the bodies that drafted the system's design. From an astrophysical standpoint, the first pass of an intruder would set up resonances that amplify with every orbit. You would see shepherded gaps and clusters, just like rings around Saturn, but on a solar system scale. You would see inclination flips and secular resonances sweep through belts of debris, locking some objects and ejecting others. If the intruder moves on a long inclined path, it can seed perpendicular populations that look like they do not belong. It leaves structure behind. It leaves time bombs on elongated orbits that return as comets, centuries or millennia later. The second pass does the irreversible work. A direct impact or a deep graze sends shock through both bodies. Silicates melt. Iron segregates, volatiles boil off. A plume of molten rock sprays into orbit and coalesces into a disk around the surviving core. Within months to years, that disk clumps into a moon over tens of thousands of years. Tides circularize orbits and synchronize spins. The trauma becomes a stable pattern. The memory of the blow persists as a tilt, a scar, and a satellite that keeps vigil. When you strip away names, the narrative is straightforward. A large outsider arrives. It disturbs the locals. Close encounters cause damage. A later pass delivers the fatal collision. The architecture changes. Some fragments stabilize as a belt. One fragment becomes a habitable world with a large moon and deep seas. The cost is high. The result long-lived. This is not mystical. It's mechanical, with myth as the wrapper that carried it across millennia, so we sit with a possibility that refuses to go quiet. The Enuma Elish may be a record of the very violence that forged the cradle of life, not a parable about order and chaos, but an eyewitness report from a time when the sky delivered blows and the ground remembered. If that is true, then every tide, every eclipse, and every meteor shower is a faint rehearsal of the event that gave us this world. And if Nibiru played the part of the destroyer that became the midwife, then its story does not end with the collision. Worlds that shape other worlds do not dissolve into legend and vanish. They leave orbits that close in long arcs. They leave consequences and obligations. They leave beings who would have tracked the cycles and returned to the world born from their violence. They didn't arrive as gods, they arrived as contractors. The story, as told through Sitchin's lens, starts with a failing world where survival depended on a metal mined in another sky. 450,000 years ago, a fleet descended to Earth not with hymns but with drills. They surveyed shorelines, traced riverbeds, inserted probes into ancient sediments, and marked out zones by conductivity and ore signatures. Their first site sat where freshwater rivers feed a shallow gulf, a practical choice for transport, cooling and refining. They called the outpost a name that would later echo in Mesopotamian city lists. Its purpose was simple: take gold out of the ground, turn it into something airborne and ship it home. The crisis on their world, Nibiru, is described as a chemical problem. Its upper air layers thinned, its protective envelope weakened, and radiation seeped through. The fix wasn't spiritual, it was particulate physics. Fine gold would serve as suspended mirrors, a reflective haze anchoring a shield, thin, stable, and capable of cutting radiation. That concept, controversial to many, echoes the way modern labs talk about metallic aerosols and nanoparticle films. For them, it meant the difference between climate collapse and a viable sky ore from rivers and deposits wasn't enough. They needed volume, repeatable process, and a system that ran like industry. The mission that followed was, by their record, the first interplanetary mining operation in our solar system's memory. They deployed a workforce they already had, the Igigi. For ages, these crews ran extraction under harsh conditions. They dug, smelted, hauled and ferried loads to coastal platforms. The work ground on for so long that it outlasted job rotations and patience. The mutiny, when it came, wasn't symbolic. It was a refusal to keep moving ore after millennia of exhaustion. Tools dropped. Lines broke. Supervisors found themselves outnumbered, and the command structure faced a choice: suppress the revolt and continue bleeding labour, or change the design of the workforce itself. That decision opened the door to Enki's program. Ancient lines describe it obliquely, mixing clay with the life of a god, but the workflow, as Sitchin mapped it, looks like a series of genetic trials. Take a local hominid, catalogue its traits, and test where edits would take. If the base specimen was Homo erectus, the objectives were clear: boost cognitive function, improve vocal and manual coordination, widen the learning window, and hardwire compliance to repetitive task cycles. The lab sequence runs like a modern protocol. Identify genetic targets, blend donor material, carry embryos to term with surrogates, observe developmental milestones. When the prototype survived and obeyed commands and tools stayed in hand without constant supervision, they had their worker. They called the result a mixed one, a blend. The worker could take instruction and perform mining tasks with fewer breaks and less revolt. But success created a new problem. Intelligence does not freeze, it expands. These early workers learned more than their job. They watched, they copied, they developed social hierarchies and subtle methods for bending rules. The lab had made workers, but it had also made people. That's where the brothers diverged. Enki saw an emergent partner. He favoured granting skills, language, and reproductive autonomy. A sentient workforce could maintain sites, solve problems, and eventually handle more complex roles. Enlil, who commanded operations, saw risk. A workforce that thinks can bargain and resist. He insisted on control, limited access to knowledge, tight supervision, and resets when settlements drifted from directive. Their debate did not stay in the lab, it spilled into every policy decision. Training programs, access to tools, and where to settle new populations became battle lines. The timeline winds itself around a number that appears again and again: 3,600. In the Sumerian sexagesimal system, that unit, called a Shah, marks a complete Nibiruan year. One long loop, Sitchin tied that cycle to Earth events. When Nibiru drew near, the solar system felt it. Climate regimes shifted. Ice advanced or retreated, fault lines awakened. Civilizations that were ready survived. Those that weren't ended. Ancient lists with reigns that stretch into impossible spans transform if those spans are counted in Shahs, not Earth years. The king list then become ledgers of administration under a different clock, punctuated by resets and handovers across orbits. Between cycles, the network grew. Mining sites extended beyond the marshlands to mountains and deserts. Where placer deposits had washed down for eons, logistics improved. Smelting advanced from crude furnaces to temperature-controlled processes. Shipping schedules synchronized with launch windows, and a cadence developed. Mine, refine, ship, shield. Human settlements clustered near resources and transport hubs. In the archives, this era looks like a grid overlaying the fertile crescents and mountain belts of the ancient Near East and beyond. The flood sits at the hinge point, not as a morality play, but as physics. When a large mass passes, it tugs at everything. Ice sheets don't need direct contact to fail. They need stress. A passing gravitational field can raise tides under the ice, lubricate base layers, and release locked oceans. In that window, warnings were issued, but not publicly, and not by those in command. Enki, bound by his own rules yet unwilling to watch his creations drown, passed on a survival plan to a trusted human. Build high, seal, preserve seeds and knowledge. The story that survives in later texts keeps the bones, a vessel, a deluge, a survivor who returns to a cleaned world. After the waters, the map changed. New cities rose on higher ground. Calendars reset. The promise to hold back certain knowledge faded, and humans gained access to agriculture, astronomy and writing at a pace that would look like a jump to any later historian. The workforce became a culture. Rituals encoded operating procedures. Festivals mapped to orbits and harvest cycles that balanced production with the sky's rhythm. But the brothers' conflict did not end. Enlil's camp enforced boundaries, sometimes with force. Stories speak of cities reduced to ash and salt, stretches of land where nothing living thrived for generations. Sitchin pointed to a moment around 1600 BC, when an escalation used weapons that altered soil chemistry and fused surfaces into glassy crust. Texts from the region tell of winds that poison, skies that darken, and people who suffer burns without flame. In his argument, those were remnants of an interplanetary dispute fought on Earth, a war that ended a chapter of Sumerian civilization and marked the beginning of a withdrawal. Withdrawal didn't mean abandonment, it meant a shift to remote management. Bloodlines seeded into royal houses provided continuity and leverage. Priests carried technical calendars as rights. Law codes embedded resource quotas as moral duty. The command chain moved from open rule to guidance through symbols, councils, and selection. Knowledge that once sat in workshops now wore ritual garments and sounded like religion. But it continued to schedule the sky, measure the land, and train administrators who served cycles larger than their lifetimes. Resets continued on the Shah. The number became a metronome. Every long count approached, watchers scanned horizon markers, and records were updated with cautionary notes. Ice advanced. Rivers shifted. Empires rose and fell in time with a cosmic pendulum that few remembered consciously, but that institutions tracked carefully behind closed doors. Where mainstream chronologies list droughts, migrations and collapses, Sitchin offered a single driver: the return of the parent orbit. Even the way these stories crossed borders carries the imprint of management. What the people called gods were, in this view, office holders with technical specialties: craft, law, water, sky. These were departments, not pantheons. The same function wore different names as it moved from Sumer to Akkad to Babylon and into later cultures, each translation sanding down details while preserving the job description. Across time, the logos changed, the uniform updated, but the role remained. By the late 2nd millennium BC, direct appearances quieted. The roles shifted to families that intermarried across cities and empires, keeping lineages intact. These lines held rights that looked like theatre, but contained tables and star positions. Rulers drew legitimacy by tracing descent not just to earlier kings, but to an origin before the flood. Chosen families moved wealth and knowledge across borders without losing either. The network became quieter but deeper. Under this reading, every major disruption in human history sits within a scheduling framework. The cycle sets the pressure. Internal tensions determine where the break occurs. When the sky pushes, the weakest link snaps. Sometimes that link is an empire. Other times it's a climate regime. Either way, the archive keeps the beat with that same number. And for those who knew, the task was not to stop the cycle. That was impossible. But to place assets where they would survive it. Gold remained the thread through it all. The mission never stopped needing it. Even as demand shifted and processes refined, shipments continued. Where open mines fell silent, underground veins took their place. Where coastal platforms eroded, inland facilities rose. Humans, once miners, became managers, traders, and stewards. But the flow stayed pointed toward a single purpose: maintain the shield, maintain the world that sent them. The end of overt rule did not look like defeat. It looked like maturity of a system. Nodes on Earth could run for stretches without direct visits, guided by calendars and reinforced by bloodlines, trained to obey signals they no longer recognized as signals. Those left behind held two mandates: preserve the line, preserve the schedule. When later ages talked about covenants and chosen houses, they may have been reciting operational requirements wearing sacred language. If that's the frame, then the narrative of human ascent carries a different tone. We did not rise in isolation. We were placed, trained, tested, and then left with enough tools to maintain a set of systems bigger than any single nation. The cost was autonomy, the gain was survival, and the clock that set our rises and falls has not, in this telling, stopped its sweep. That leads to a hard question. If the operators stepped back, someone still had to keep the calendars, teach the timings, and guard the archives that tell when the next pressure point arrives. Those networks did not dissolve. They adapted, changed names, and moved into houses that still sit at the centre of power. The sky cycles remain, and somewhere, the old schedules still inform decisions that most people think are about politics or economics, but answer to a much older appointment. If those beings pulled back from open rule, they would not rely on chance to keep their plans alive. They would leave caretakers, bloodlines would carry the biology, orders would guard the memory, institutions would hold calendars most people never see, and a timetable that outlives empires. Ancient kingship lists start to look different through that lens. Dynasties read like lab notes passed from one reign to the next. Succession isn't just politics. It becomes protocol. The tale of a crown bestowed from heaven reads like a transfer of stewardship with genetic terms attached. In this view, palace schools weren't teaching poetry. They were training archivists to read the sky. The air learned star-rising times along with land taxes. The ritual of coronation doubled as a reboot of the clock, aligning rule with a cycle that didn't begin with humans and wouldn't end with them. Now consider how knowledge survives across collapses. If open temples fall, you move it into closed rooms. Secret societies in this telling didn't appear as intellectual clubs but as hard shells around small seeds of dangerous content. One group protects a list of stars and their portents. Another keeps an oath line: who may marry whom, who may bear children with whom, and which traits must remain within the house. What can't be said in the street becomes a symbol carved in wood, painted on ceilings, or encoded in ritual steps. If a thing must cross centuries, it hides in plain sight. Astronomical know-how does drift, but it doesn't drift randomly. Babylonian astronomer priests keep tablets of rising times and retrogrades. When their city-states fade, that habit of sky-keeping survives in Hellenistic mystery schools that blend math with myth. An Egyptian temple trained scribes in practical geometry and calendar correction. Later, that same skill shows up as medieval alchemy's silent obsession with cycles and conjunctions. By the Renaissance, esoteric order stage plays of the heavens where each officer represents a star or node, and the meeting itself maps a cosmic configuration. A rite at equinox isn't just ceremony, it's a timestamp on a larger clock. The thread through all of this is continuity, the careful handoff of skycraft disguised as philosophy. Iconography bolsters the story for those who want to see the link. The winged disc from old reliefs lives on as a solar emblem that hovers over altars and arches. A single, all-seeing eye reappears as a sign of surveillance from above, a reminder that authority flows from a vantage point outside human affairs. Serpents become shorthand for knowledge that coils and sheds, a living cycle embedded in teaching. Celestial hierarchies map gods to planets to officers in an initiatory ladder. You don't just climb ranks, you move from Mars to Jupiter to Saturn in a moral ascent that is also a tour of the sky. If the original story was about a returning world, these symbols keep the narrative alive without ever naming it. This brings us back to the translator who drew fire. Through a conspiratorial lens, his work reads like managed leakage. Let a civilian publish an interpretation bold enough to move culture, but keep the lawyerly footnotes out of reach. Offer pieces that can acclimate the public to a larger frame, off-world origins, engineered ancestry, a long orbital period, while stopping short of data that would trigger panic. In that framing, he is either a brave decoder or a messenger positioned by hands that prefer dimmers to light switches. This view doesn't rise or fall on whether every tablet means what he said. It rests on motive and pacing, say enough to shift a generation, withhold enough to maintain options. Bloodlines sit at the core of this narrative. The claim is simple and stark. Some families hold power because of an ancient covenant tied to genetics, not luck or markets. Their genealogies don't read like family albums, they read like ledgers of trait preservation. Marriage patterns look less like romance and more like selective breeding. A crest isn't decoration. It's an encoded claim that the bearer carries a fragment of an old bargain. In this landscape, inheritance law doubles as population management, and heraldry doubles as an archive of rights and duties. The authority to rule is framed as a biological license issued ages ago and renewed each generation with oath and ritual. The migration from cloistered lodges to modern boardrooms becomes easier to see when you treat councils as priesthoods. In this model, conferences that set agendas for currencies and climate strategies also serve as calendar checks. The faces change, the suits change, but the habit persists. Gather the initiated, compare the clock, adjust the plan. A panel on risk reads like a sermon on cycles. A closed-door session on resilience doubles as a survival briefing. The surface topic is finance. The subtext is time. If you accept the premise of a 3,600-year pulse, you build systems that can bend to it, that mean supply routes that can vanish, archives that can move, and seed banks that never need a press release. There's a harder edge to the controlled disclosure idea. If elite networks wanted the public to digest a story too large to shock in one dose, they might feed it in motifs films about engineered humans, shows about ancient visitors, books about cataclysms keyed to calendars. You soften the ground over decades. By the time a sober paper proposes a distant massive object on a long orbit, the culture is ready to discuss it without a stampede. The surface claim is scientific caution. Underneath, the narrative has been normalized. That is the logic of preparation without admission. Symbols keep working while names shift. A winged disc becomes a corporate logo. A serpent coils around a staff in plain view. An eye crowns a pyramid on a banknote. Even if you reject any literal link, the repetition keeps the cadence of the old story alive. Each image hints at oversight, cycles, ascent and descent. Each ritual, procession, oath, initiation runs on astronomical timing. A lodge opens when a star rises in the east. It closes when that light sets. The language stays metaphorical. The schedule stays precise. If preservation is the goal, secrecy isn't just taste, it's function. Open claims can be challenged. Esoteric lineages hide behind plausible deniability. A closed circle passes instruction from voice to ear, leaving a little paper to burn. The structure looks familiar. Outer ranks gather in public. Inner ranks hold the calendar. Learn the knock. Earn the password and you get a little more of the map. Few see the clock in full. Those who do bear a burden, or so the story says, keep the timeline and make sure the infrastructure survives the interval no one else expects. The case for continuity rests on habits that don't break. Across centuries, certain families appear near ports, mints, archives, and observatories. They fund catalogues of stars, they sponsor expeditions, they endow chairs in astronomy while also underwriting antiquarian studies. Through this lens, philanthropy doubles as procurement. Recruit minds, steer research, make sure the next generation of clock keepers grows up with the right mentors and the right peer groups. When public budgets swing, private funds carry the thread across lean years. The chain survives in footnotes and fellowships. Seen this way, meetings that look like economic summits carry a secondary layer. The agenda items track crop yields and bond rates, but the slide decks also track cycles of drought, solar activity, and long-term celestial models. You don't name Nibiru in the minutes. You talk about low-probability, high-impact events and continuity of governance. If the belief in a return underwrites the strategy, the policy outcomes tilt toward redundancy. Distributed data vaults, hardened networks, modular infrastructure, prearranged population filters built into law. Publicly, it's prudence. Privately, it's a timetable. A darker rationale underlies this structure. Preserving knowledge isn't about lording it over the crowd. In this telling, it's about keeping a civilization kit ready for a day when you might have to rebuild from scrap. If you think resets are real, you pour resources into seed banks, gene libraries, underground archives, and training cadres who can live without modern support. The point isn't to dominate, it's to outlast. If the cycle demands a flood of any kind, literal or systemic, you plan arcs. You select crews, you write procedures that assume hand tools and no satellites. Survival becomes the measure of wisdom. Ethics become triage. This perspective reframes continuity programs as ethical dilemmas. Who decides which knowledge is essential? Who gets a seat when the elevator down into the mountain opens? A charter written in the language of stewardship reads one way to the chosen and another way to everyone else. It also explains why myth and science mingle in the same halls. The story binds people to a purpose. The data guides the build. Both are necessary if the plan spans centuries. None of this proves the old timeline exists. It describes how a culture could act if it believed the timeline was real. Symbols layered over practical logistics, rituals glued to calendars, bloodlines guarding roles while institutions mask motives with public service language. A chain of custody that runs from scribes to scholars to policy shops, each translating the same concern for a different audience. Inside this framework, the whisper about a long orbit isn't superstition. It's a schedule the outer world doesn't need to know. If that chain holds true, then the Guardians would track not only stars but texts. They would read the old words with a technician's care, looking past hymns for coordinates and cues, and that raises the next problem. What do the source materials actually say when stripped of projection and fear? What details survive the centuries, and what meanings have been layered on top by those who serve a hidden calendar? The tablet is small, heavier than it looks, and warm from the light. You can see the wedges pressed in neat rows, each cut left by a reed stylus, and a steady hand 4,000 years ago. The edges are chipped, the surface glazed with time, but the sign clusters are clear. They're not rumours or theories, they're the record, inkless, baked, stubborn. When you read about Nibiru here, you're not in a forum or a late-night radio call-in. You're standing with a clerk priest who knew the sky like a ledger and wrote what he saw and what his culture believed the heavens meant. Here's where the ground under the popular story starts to shift. Nibiru is not Sumerian, it's Akkadian. That matters more than it sounds. Sumerian city-states had fallen silent long before the word shows up consistently. Akkadian is the language of later Babylonians and Assyrians, a 1,000-year gap from the world Sitchin tied it to. When the term appears, it belongs to a different era's skywatchers, a different priesthood, and a vocabulary already shaped by centuries of reinterpretation. In those later texts, Nibiru points to a function, not a home address. The root sense is crossing, or passage. In Babylonian cosmology and star lists, it acts like a celestial checkpoint or marker. When a planet reached a particular station, when it crossed a crucial line in the sky, the scribes could call that Nibiru. In many catalogues and ritual calendars, the object most often wearing that title is Jupiter. The reason fits their theology. Jupiter was tied to Marduk, the royal god, so a prominent stabilizing light near key sky positions earned the name associated with rule and order. But the tablets refuse to stay simple. Some fragments call Nibiru a red star. Jupiter isn't red. Other texts list Jupiter separately and still mention Nibiru, hinting that in those contexts the term points to something else. Scholars argue over which lines are damaged, which lists reflect older traditions, and whether red refers to colour in the sky or a ritual classification. The contradictions don't fully cancel one another. They show a term that moved across time, picking up uses as it travelled. Context helps. In the Enuma Elish, Nibiru is connected to the role of a regulator, a place or star that keeps order. That's the opposite of a rogue destroyer. It's a title you give to the thing that anchors the map. In other tablets, the word appears in ceremonial instructions and in descriptions of ominous signs. If the term shows up mainly when something special happens, festivals, kingly rites, eclipses, unusual sky appearances, then we're likely dealing with a label for significance, not a catalogue entry for a hidden world. Babylonian astronomy blends categories we keep separate. Planets are gods, gods are legal authorities, constellations are calendars, sky cycles are moral narratives about kingship, debt, flood and favour. The same name can point to a planet on Monday, a mythic role on Tuesday, and a sky position on New Year's. That fluidity is not confusion, it's a system. When a scribe writes Nibiru, he might be labelling the crossing of a planet at the equinox line, honouring Jupiter as Marduk in that act, and marking an omen for the palace all at once. This is where both camps start picking teams of lines. Mainstream translations that equate Nibiru with Jupiter foreground the catalogues where the mapping is plain. Nibiru is the one that stands at year's end in the west and at year's beginning in the east, a behaviour that matches Jupiter's annual dance. Supporters of a hidden planet emphasise the red star phrases and the lists that name Jupiter and Nibiru separately, arguing that the distinction means the term points to something rarer, something that appears only under certain conditions. Each side trims away the messy middle to keep a clear story. The ritual apocalyptic layer muddies it further. Some incantations and omen series mention Nibiru only inside scenarios of upheaval, flood warnings, plague seasons, eclipses that break pattern. If the term activates only when the sky deviates from normal, or when a sky event lands on a sacred date, the word gathers a charge. It reads less like everyday astronomy, and more like the label for a threshold event that can look, to modern readers, like a memory of a rare intruder. It can also be a way to mark a predictable planet at an unpredictable moment. Multiple meanings grew over time. Early uses may point to a specific star or crossing point. As Marduk's cult rose in Babylon, Jupiter's status rose with it. Titles migrate in empires. The king's name settles on the king's planet. Later tablets speak more directly of Nibiru in the role Jupiter plays. That evolution explains why some sources split the terms while later ones merge them, and why the same word can feel like a coordinate, a deity's office, and a planetary alias depending on the century. When we ask what the tablets actually say, the alien homeworld vanishes. What remains is technical skywork braided with theology and statecraft. You find lists of rising times, heliacal appearances, intervals and corrections the scribes applied to keep calendars in sync with harvests and festivals. You find gods mapped onto those cycles so the empire could say the king ruled under ordered skies. In that mesh, Nibiru labels the crossing that mattered most to their system, and often the planet fit to carry that load was Jupiter. Still, the ambiguous pieces are hard to ignore. A red star is an odd fit. A separate listing alongside Jupiter nags at the edge of the neat model. Those fragments keep the door open for a special appearance. Cometary, transient or atmospheric, where haze and dust tint an object red and make it look rare. That might explain why the word leans into ceremonial and catastrophic contexts and away from routine records. There's also the language gap between ancient metaphor and modern physics. If a culture lacks the terms for resonance, inclination, and eccentricity, it tells the story of a crossing, a door, a shepherd that keeps the flock aligned. It calls the planet by the god's name when it reaches the threshold. Myth doesn't erase data, it encodes it. The danger is on both sides. Strip the myth and you miss the signal. Romanticize the myth and you invent a signal that isn't there. So the cherry-picking isn't a quirk of bad actors. It's a trap built into the source material. Clean answers come from selective reading. A fuller reading admits layered meaning and evolving usage. That's frustrating if you want a single identity for Nibiru. It's also faithful to how these tablets worked inside their culture. Practical astronomy, performing theology for a state that demanded order from the sky down. Taken together, the tablets present a term that crosses categories on purpose. Nibiru functions as a literal observation point, a ritual marker, and an office held by a planet that symbolises rule. In many periods, that office belongs to Jupiter. In some contexts, it's something appearing red, rare, and ominous. Those layers can live in one word without proving a hidden world with a 3,600-year orbit. They can also preserve a memory of patterns and events that felt larger than any one definition could hold. If ancient Mesopotamian texts wrapped sky facts in sacred language, then similar layers may lie inside other flood stories and destroyer myths, the places where the heavens turn from calendar to warning. Step away from the tablets for a moment and look at the pattern that refuses to die. Across continents and centuries, disconnected peoples told nearly the same story. A hostile light in the sky appears, the world heaves, waters turn foul and whole eras end. The names change, the gods shift, but the core memory stays intact. A celestial intruder arrives, and life splits into a before and an after. This isn't the kind of coincidence that comes from trade routes or borrowed myths. It feels like the survivor's shorthand for something you only need to learn once. The clearest account lives in a text that shouldn't exist at all, the Kolbrin's Destroyer. It doesn't sing about the gods or moral lessons, it reads like field notes from an event that upended everything. A red star tears open the sky. It rains stones that are not stones but blazing fragments, and a fine dust settles afterward, turning rivers bitter and livestock mad. The descriptions hit like technical reports. Heat in the air before the object arrives, winds that shift direction without weather fronts, a strange copper haze that lingers and burns the lungs. There is no allegory here. It catalogues symptoms, like a physician mapping an illness of the planet. The language gets clinical when it lists what the destroyer does to ground and sea. Black clouds boil where no storm formed, and waters rise against shorelines that have never known such tides. The land tilts, not like an earthquake's quick jolt, but a prolonged lean that resets the horizon. People do not describe that unless they watch the sky and feel the floor move under them. The effect looks like a gravitational tide sweeping through everything solid. Buildings fail without hitting their resonant frequency. Hills slump and then hold. A distant source applies a slow, relentless pull, and the entire crust complains at once. Egypt left its version in a god's changing face. The Eye of Ra protects until it does not. When humanity offends, Ra unleashes the eye as Sekhmet, the lioness who hunts by heat. This is usually tucked into the category of moral cosmic theatre, but the details are cruelly physical. Fields run red, yes, but the rage stops only when the heat is tricked into drinking something that dulls the fire. As a memory of a sky that turns red and violent, it tracks how a community might cope. Name the force, describe its teeth, give it a ritual endpoint. A red sky that bites becomes a goddess whose anger can be sated. Underneath the myth is a season where the sun was not the sun, and the air itself felt predatory. The Greeks kept the warning inside a cautionary ride. Phaethon takes the solar chariot and loses control. The earth scorches, mountains smoke, ocean steam. Then a final strike from above removes the threat and the world recalibrates. Strip out the characters and you have a rogue body falling in too close, trajectories shifting faster than habit can absorb, and a violent correction that ends with the thing flung away. It matches the profile of a near miss. Too much heat, too fast from a source that has no business sharing our sky, followed by a sharp departure that leaves behind a charred record and a story adults tell children when they ask why. The Bible's wormwood narrows the focus to water. A great star falls like a burning torch. Rivers and springs turn bitter. Many die. The specifics matter. This is not a vague curse spread thin over the planet. It names fresh water and describes a contaminant that moves through it. The cause reads as particulate and chemical rather than moral. You can see how a civilization would remember a storm of debris, a dust that dissolves into aquifers, a body that enters the atmosphere shedding a tale of poison. People would note where the damage concentrates, rivers and wells, and they would name the star after the taste it left behind. Indigenous prophecies keep the cycle visible in ways history books do not. The Hopi speak of the blue star Kachina as the sign that the fourth world closes, a purifier follows. The sequence sounds ritual, but it behaves like an astronomical alert. First, a new light appears with a blue cast, the kind of hue that comets and ionized tails show under particular conditions. Then comes cleansing. Not the vanishing of a few villages, but a reset that changes how time gets counted. Mesoamerican cycles end with floods and fire. Norse stories lock in a sky that splits, a world tree that shakes, and a firebringer who walks when the old order breaks. Each speaks the grammar of endings tied to a sky event, not a human scandal. As this pattern expands, the overlap stops looking like borrowing and starts sounding like trauma records. People everywhere use the vocabulary they have to narrate a once-in-many-lifetimes event. A people with priests and calculating astronomy write it in sky terms. A people with strong moral law codes express it as judgment. A people with seasonal ritual encode it in turnings of the age. You can see how a red object becomes a lioness, how a heat wave becomes a dragon's breath, how a dust storm that poisons wells becomes a named star that falls. The witnesses differ, but the symptoms align. What makes these accounts stubborn is how they preserve the mechanics. Burning stones fall before the worst of the winds. That order makes sense if debris arrives on different trajectories than the main body. A surge in tide precedes visible waves when the ocean responds to gravitational forcing before the atmosphere catches up. Fields of fine dust appear downwind and downstream, as if delivered by high-altitude plumes and then washed into watersheds. Even the detail of people suffering madness under red skies fits how charged particles and toxic aerosols affect brains under stress. None of this needs a sermon to work. It needs a cause that visits, alters the whole system and leaves. Skeptics argue that humans naturally invent sky gods to explain drought, famine, and social breakdown. That happens. But there's a difference between inventing an angry deity and recording identical chains of physical effect across unrelated traditions. When the same order repeats, red light, hot winds, meteors, bitter water, shifting ground, you're not reading a culture's personality. You're reading a sequence written by physics that is why the destroyer passages land like field notes. They read like the kind of list you make when you have to teach the children how to survive the next time the sky does that. There is another layer, how memory compresses. No one remembers the orbital elements of a long-period intruder. They remember what hurt. So the signs become teachable chunks. Watch for a new star that changes colour. Listen for winds that arrive without a storm line. If the horizons lean, move inland. If the water tastes wrong, burn it off or avoid it. The global pattern becomes a safety manual disguised as myth, copied because it worked, not because it was pretty. This doesn't mean every story points to the same object or the same era. It may be that multiple events, cometary showers, regional impacts, volcanic winters that dyed skies red, folded into one master narrative, Yet the shared skeleton remains hard to dismiss. A thing appears in the sky. It does not act like the usual things. The environment goes non-linear. When balance returns, calendars reset. That is what a civilization would save if it wanted descendants to outlive the next round. Scientific language slots into this without force. A large body on a long path can disturb outer reservoirs of ice and rock. Waves of debris arrive centuries apart. Fine dust interacts with sunlight and chemistry to colour the sky and foul the water. Infrared heat rises before the visible source shows because the atmosphere begins to respond to the changing energy balance. Tides jump because gravity acts at a distance, and the crust behaves like a slow liquid under enough stress. None of this requires direct impact. Gravity and debris do most of the work, and they leave a signature in stories people cannot forget. Fire that is not fire, water that is not safe, ground that forgets where level is. If this is memory, then it explains why the warnings are stubborn and why the names differ. People wrote down what they saw and built gods that could hold it: the destroyer, the eye, the charioteer, the star with a bitter name. Each is a mask over the same wound. You don't need one culture to teach another. You need one sky to misbehave in front of both. The haunting possibility is simple. Myths may be data, stored in narrative because paper burns and computers fail, but stories ride with us. They're compact, portable, and resilient. They outlive regimes, languages, and empires. When the event comes back, the story is there waiting, not to preach, but to instruct. Watch the sky. Notice the colour. Taste the water. Move fast when the ground starts to lean. And remember that the worst comes in stages, not all at once. If ancient cultures recorded a celestial destroyer, and if those records preserve more symptom than sermon, then the modern sky should still carry residue from whatever passed before. That is where the telescopes point now, not to retell old myths, but to find the heavy hand that left these fingerprints. Uranus was the first planet to embarrass Newton in public. Its path wandered from the neat curves the equations predicted, sometimes arriving early to where it should be, sometimes lagging as if a hidden hand tugged at it from the dark. Astronomers tried to blame bad data, flawed telescopes, even unseen swarms of comets. The mismatch kept showing up anyway. The only explanation that held its ground was simple but unsettling. There was more mass out there than anyone had accounted for. Something heavy, something unseen. In the 1840s, that problem sat on a desk in Paris staring down a young mathematician who refused to concede that nature was misbehaving. Urbain Le Verrier covered his pages with orbital elements, perturbation terms and error bounds, stripping away excuses until the residue pointed outward. If Uranus drifted, it drifted for a reason. He treated every deviation like a breadcrumb. The pattern that emerged was not random. It mapped to a coherent source beyond Uranus, with a specific mass range and a specific position along the ecliptic, as if an invisible world had left a fingerprint in the numbers. Le Verrier then did the most audacious thing an astronomer could do without a telescope. He wrote coordinates. He calculated where the phantom should be on the sky that week, how bright it might appear, and how fast it would move against the star field. He mailed those coordinates to Berlin, asking for a test. No grand theory, no plea for funding, just a point on the dome of the night and the quiet confidence that gravity does not lie. On September the 23rd, 1846, Johann Galle turned the Berlin Observatory's refractor to the position Le Verrier had marked. On the very first night, within a degree of the prediction, a small disk showed motion against the fixed stars Neptune, a world discovered first in the algebra, then in the eyepiece. The lesson landed hard. You could pull a planet out of darkness with mathematics alone, provided you listened carefully enough to the way other planets were misbehaving. That should have closed the book. It didn't. Even after analysts accounted for Neptune and refined its mass, small residuals remained in the motions of Uranus and Neptune. The numbers grew smaller as measurements improved. But a whisper stayed in the data. The gravitational ghost did not vanish. It faded, regrouped, and invited a second hunt. At Flagstaff, decades later, Percival Lowell took up the invitation and turned it into a lifelong pursuit. He built an observatory in the clean, cold air for one goal: find the body that still bent the giant's paths. He ran calculations for hypothetical orbits, then set up plate cameras to stare night after night. Assistants blink-compared glass plates to catch anything that moved. Lowell refined ephemerides, updated perturbation estimates, and kept recalculating while the desert frost grew on the dome. He died without seeing the culprit, but his program kept running, an engine that turned patience into discovery. In 1930, Clyde Tombaugh, a methodical young observer at Lowell's observatory, found a dim wanderer inching along the ecliptic on his plate's Pluto. The announcement hit newspapers as the long-sought Planet X. For a moment, it seemed the story had symmetry, but Pluto's mass estimate kept shrinking as techniques improved. It was thousands of times too light to nudge Uranus and Neptune the way the anomalies implied. The celebratory arc bent into an awkward truth. Pluto was real, but it was not the gravitational author of the earlier whispers Lowell's quarry remained unaccounted for. With better observations, some astronomers argued the anomalies were phantoms born of measurement errors and poor mass estimates for Neptune. As spacecraft flybys and radar ranging sharpened the numbers, the residuals seemed to quiet. Funding pivoted to other questions. The trail went cold, not because anyone proved a hidden world could not exist, but because the motive to keep looking weakened when the math stopped shouting. Then the edge of the solar system changed. In 1992, astronomers began to find a population of small, icy bodies beyond Neptune. Not one or two, but a belt. A new architecture. The Kuiper Belt redrew the map. Instead of a lone Pluto haunting the dark, thousands of objects traced long ellipses and resonant paths. The outer system was not an empty moat. It was a crowded field with structure, gaps, and patterns. And with that crowded field came fresh anomalies, this time not in the orbits of the gas giants, but in the paths of the ice worlds themselves. As survey catalogues grew, researchers noticed a subset of these distant objects refused to randomize. Their long axes pointed in similar directions. Their perihelia clustered in space rather than spreading evenly. They tilted at comparable angles relative to the rest of the system. Independent sky surveys using different instruments and search areas kept returning the same pattern. It didn't look like a selection bias artifact. It looked like a shepherd's hand at work over millions of years. The historical echo was hard to ignore. A century and a half after Leverrier deduced Neptune from Uranus's discomfort, modern teams were again staring at deviations and asking the same question. What mass could do this? The difference now was the target class. Instead of gas giants registering the pull, it was a school of far-flung, fragile worlds tracing scars of a long, slow influence. The physics was still Newton's, the method still perturbation analysis, but the evidence had moved outward and grown colder. Behind the scenes of that growing dataset was a quiet recalibration of expectations. If a single new world existed, it was not going to sit on a neat, near-circular track like the familiar 8. The cluster geometry hinted at a massive perturber on an elongated inclined orbit, with a period measured in many thousands of years. Such a body would spend nearly all its time far from the Sun, faint enough to hide in the background of the Milky Way, slow enough that motion across successive images would barely register. Detection would require patience measured in seasons, not nights, and a willingness to sift wide fields of sky that had never been systematically combed at that depth. The shift from "is there another planet" to what architecture would produce these alignments brought new tools into play. Computer simulations took over as the main way to test hypotheses, feed in a candidate planet mass, eccentricity and inclination, seed a virtual Kuiper Belt with thousands of test particles, and let the integration run for billions of simulated years. If, at the end, the surviving objects clustered the way the actual sky did. The model survived to the next round. If the alignment fell apart, the virtual planet's parameters were wrong. The method was merciless and repeatable. That cycle of prediction and check mirrored Leverrier's approach, but with more data and more silicon. Where he sent a single set of coordinates to Berlin, modern teams sent parameter ranges to supercomputers and waited for the emergent patterns. The goal was the same: reduce the space of possibilities until the sky had only one plausible author for the anomalies. Even as simulations tightened constraints, observers kept pushing the hardware. Wide-field cameras surveyed swaths of sky looking for the faintest motion. Old plates were rescanned. Catalogues were cross-matched. The result was a growing census of detached worlds, objects whose orbits were too stretched to be explained by Neptune's reach alone. These bodies became the smoking casings at a crime scene. They pointed back to an agent with enough mass to sculpt their paths while staying out of sight. The hunt psychology began to resemble the 19th century chase again. You could feel the same mixture of humility and stubbornness. If the math and the sky keep agreeing on a pattern, you follow the pattern. You accept the boredom of false positives, sensor glitches, and background galaxies pretending to move. You accept that a discovery can be as much about endurance as brilliance. Through all this, the number of candidate explanations rose and fell, but the gravitational clue stayed stable. Something massive can explain multiple independent features. With one cause, one entity can both cluster perihelia and populate certain resonances. One entity can tilt and detach. The elegance of a single source weighed against the messiness of alternative schemes that demanded multiple small influences stacked together. At this point, the history loops back to its origin, not by repetition of facts, but by rhyme. A nameless pull reveals itself through disobedient orbits. A desk full of calculations condenses the sky into a few testable predictions. An observatory answers. In 1846, the answer was Neptune. In the late 20th century, the answer was a belt reshaping our expectations. By the early 21st, the answer is not yet a photograph, but the simulations keep murmuring the same conclusion. A heavy distant body organises chaos into pattern. The Kuiper Belt's discovery in 1992 was the pivot that made this phase possible. It exposed the outer system as a dynamic laboratory instead of a static backdrop. It provided many more test particles for gravity to write on. It revealed edges and voids where gradual fades should have been, and it highlighted alignments that invited explanation rather than dismissal. Once the belt came into focus, the ghost hunt stopped being about repairing Uranus's dignity and started being about understanding a complex evolving perimeter. Now the lights are dim in a modern control room. Screens show starfields dotted with faint points. Code scrolls through orbital solutions. Teams argue about error bars and survey completeness. And beneath the noise, a familiar message repeats in the math. There is something massive moving beyond Neptune. The first time humanity heard that sentence, it pointed to a blue giant we could eventually see. This time it points to an object so distant and slow that its proof may arrive first as a consensus in equations before a sensor ever catches its face. 4.5 billion miles out, sunlight feels like a rumour. It arrives as the brightest pinprick in a black field, not a warm disk. Space here keeps its own tempo. Temperatures sit near -400 Fahrenheit. Objects move slow, or not at all, unless something larger tells them to. And that's where the strangeness starts. A handful of extreme trans-Neptunian objects don't behave like the rest. Their orbits stretch long and thin. Their closest approaches all lean the same way. Their farthest points bunch up in one narrow slice of sky. You hear the names Sedna, 2012 VP113, and an object everyone calls Biden, and you notice they share a posture as if they learned to face the same direction. They sit millions of miles apart, yet they tilt together. On paper, That should not happen. If these bodies formed and evolved on their own, every angle would scatter. The sky would look like a busy airport map, arrivals and departures, no pattern. Instead, the data stacks in the same quadrant. The odds that this alignment emerged by chance land around 1 in 14,000. That number jolts even cautious astronomers. Randomness does not produce matching longitudes of perihelion and clustered arguments of perihelion across different surveys without a push. Something is acting like a coach on the sideline, whistling directions that the ice worlds obey. The case grew stronger when different teams, using different telescopes and different search footprints, kept finding the same pattern. It wasn't one survey bias repeating itself. Each project had its own blind spots, its own cadence of sky time, its own software, yet the orientations converged again and again. Konstantin Batygin took that pile of alignments and tried to break it. He checked for confounders, for data artifacts, for errors in the pipelines. Then he did the unglamorous work. He built models, set constraints, and ran simulations until the parameters stopped drifting. The clustering persisted. If you turn off the extra mass, the pattern dissolves. Turn it on, and the orbits fall into formation. Then there's the edge that shouldn't be so clean. The Kuiper Belt's population declines beyond about 50 astronomical units, in a way that looks abrupt. It feels like walking through a forest that ends at a straight-cut wall. You expect a thinning tree line, you get a cliff. For years, some explained it as an observational limit fainter objects drop below detection. But deeper surveys kept showing the same drop, and the physics of a sharp boundary began to look plausible. A massive body can clear lanes, eject smaller objects into long trajectories, and lock others into resonances that evacuate certain regions. The outcome is a cliff where a gentle slope should be. A single unseen planet can accomplish both tasks over millions of years, prune the outskirts and tune the angles. Put a super-Earth or mini-Neptune on an elongated, inclined orbit, and it behaves like a slow vacuum and a patient shepherd. It steals some bodies outright, lofts others into the Oort cloud, and corrals the rest into stable configurations that keep repeating. Resonances do the heavy lifting. Every few orbits, a small object meets the planet in the same relative geometry, and small nudges accumulate into permanent structure. That process writes its signature into the sky for any survey to read. The hypothesis gained credibility because it didn't stall at explanation. It predicted new categories of objects before telescopes found them. One prediction stood out: a population of bodies with paths tilted nearly perpendicular to the plane of the solar system, around 90 degrees. That is not a normal place for debris to settle, yet follow-up searches turned up objects on those odd planes, matching the predicted orbital spacing and angles. When theory points where to look and the sky returns a hit, confidence rises. It doesn't prove a planet exists, it proves the math captures something real about the architecture. Critics pushed back with solid points. The sample of known extreme objects is small. Surveys don't scan the sky evenly. Some regions get more attention because of weather, scheduling, or instrument limitations. All of that can bias the catalogue. If you look where it's convenient, you find what's convenient. Supporters answered by folding those biases into their models and showing the clustering survives. They also emphasised the elegance of a single cause solving several puzzles at once. The orientation of the extreme objects, the presence of perpendicular orbits, the emptiness beyond 50 astronomical units, and even the tilt of the Sun's rotation axis relative to the planets. Multiple independent issues, one gravitational culprit. Go back to the numbers that fall out of these fits. The mass sits between 5 and 10 Earths, big enough to steer ice worlds but small enough to stay dark at great distance. The orbit is long and stretched, with a perihelion around 200 astronomical units, and an aphelion that may run out toward 1,200. The plane sits tilted, not level with the 8 familiar planets, but canted by a few dozen degrees. Loop time gets measured in 10,000-year chunks. On most nights, the object barely moves against the background stars. That slowness hides it. It's not invisible. It's just where we rarely look, doing what our surveys aren't built to capture quickly. Back at the Kuiper Cliff, the metaphor of a construction site keeps showing up because it feels accurate. Where you expect a messy yard, you find a swept-edge simulations that insert a distant planet, replicate that boundary better than models without one. The mechanism is familiar from closer in Jupiter sculpted the asteroid belt. Neptune shaped the inner Kuiper Belt. Add a new sculptor farther out, and the same logic applies. It removes what it can, traps what it must, and leaves its mark in the gaps. The clustering of Sedna 2012 VP113 and their cohort also matches a clean dynamical story. Their orbits point away from the planet's perihelion direction, and Bunch, where its long-range gravitational nudges push them into stable longitudes, line them up on a diagram of argument of perihelion versus longitude of ascending node. And the clumps land where the Shepherd model says they should. If you rotate the Shepherd's orbit in the model, the clumps rotate with it. That coherence, across different objects and surveys, reads like a map overlay aligning with roads that were already there. Supporters point to the way the hypothesis earns interest. It produces testable outcomes. It tells observers which patches of sky to sweep, which eccentricities to favour, and what inclinations to expect. Each new extreme object either tightens the fit or strains it. And so far the needle keeps settling near the same mass and orbital parameters critics ask for the body itself on a detector. Fair. But gravitational astronomy discovered planets before by math alone. The path from numbers to a point on the sky is a method with a record. Still, the sample size caveat matters. Add a dozen new objects that don't cluster, and the odds shift. That's why ongoing, deeper and more uniform surveys carry so much weight. The more even the coverage, the less argument about bias. The argument will not settle with one press release. It will end with either a direct detection or a catalogue that stops cooperating with the Shepherd model. For now, the catalogue cooperates. A subtle but important angle sits in the time domain. The Shepherd's long period means any close pass that would brighten it is rare on human timescales. Most of the orbit is spent far from the Sun where reflected light dwindles. Infrared surveys face their own challenges at those distances. Even a cold super-Earth emits little heat. The search becomes a grind of stacking images, tracking minuscule motions over months, and screening out false positives in crowded starfields near the galactic plane where a faint mover loves to hide. Think about the effect on the rest of the system. An extra mass with that reach explains why some detached objects' perihelia sit so high. Decoupled from Neptune's domain, Neptune can't lift those perihelia alone. A distant Shepherd can. It can also generate secular resonances that slowly alter orbital angles without obvious encounters. The fingerprints are gentle but consistent. Similar long axes, similar perihelion directions, similar inclinations that avoid particular forbidden zones. When you strip the story of labels, you're left with a plain conclusion. Multiple anomalies line up if you add one ingredient. A massive, distant planet on an elongated, inclined orbit. The models fit better. The strange gaps look intentional. The perpendicular oddballs make sense. The Sun's slight tilt finds a long-term torque source. The numbers do not care about mythology. Yet the orbit they describe, a long cold loop that spends ages in the dark and then comes nearer before retreating, does echo a shape that old stories hinted at in their own way. That echo is where the discomfort creeps in for some. It doesn't prove any narrative. It does draw a silhouette you've seen before, not in clay, but in code. An outsider on a path that takes many thousands of years to close, inclined, slow, capable of reordering the edges without ever entering the inner rooms. If that is the architecture, then the next step is simple and difficult at once. Point the right instruments to the right coordinates and wait. The sky will either reveal the Shepherd, or it will force a new idea to explain why the ice worlds dance in formation. And when the simulations that guided those coordinates first printed their numbers, the shape of the orbit looked like something ancient cultures might have recognised. The room hums with fans and fluorescent ballast. No windows, just screens. Two Caltech astronomers lean in as orbital paths trace slow arcs across a black grid. Each time they add a single massive term to the equations, the chaos settles. Distant ice worlds stop wandering and snap into formation as if answering an order. The readouts stabilise. The simulation holds. Whatever they've added isn't visible in the sky, but the math treats it like a real thing with real weight. Konstantin Batygin and Mike Brown didn't start as believers. Their plan was to test whether the strange clustering of distant Kuiper Belt objects could be a statistical fluke or a bias in how we searched the sky. They tried to break the pattern. The pattern didn't break. The only way their model stayed consistent was by adding a body 5 to 10 times Earth's mass on a huge, stretched-out orbit that takes between 10 and 20,000 years to loop the Sun once. That's the moment when a quiet thought becomes a working hypothesis. This proposed orbit refuses our neat solar system rules. It tilts about 30 degrees off the familiar plane, cuts a long ellipse deep into the dark, then swings back in past the Kuiper Belt without ever joining the family of tidy, near-circular paths. In their runs, this world behaves like an outsider, the kind you don't see at family photos but whose influence shows up in everyone's posture. Its presence explains imbalance without ever asking you to see its face. The cascade of predictions starts simple and grows. Those distant objects with strangely aligned perihelia stop being coincidences and become a herd. Their elongated orbits point roughly the same way, not because they want to, but because a heavy shepherd nudges them there over millions of years. The model also expects a very different group. Bodies pitched almost upright to the solar plane, orbits tilted by about 90 degrees. At first, that sounds like wishful thinking from a computer. Then, telescopes begin finding members of that weird, perpendicular tribe, exactly where the math said they should be. Another long-standing oddity finds a home in the same framework. The Sun's spin axis sits about 6 degrees off the orbital plane of the planets. It's subtle, but it's never made full sense. An inclined, massive planet far away can torque the whole system gently and continuously, tilting the plane like a slow, patient hand. The effect doesn't need drama, it needs time. Billions of years later, the slant we measure looks like a fossil left by that steady pull. Then come the detached oddities. These are icy bodies with orbits so elongated and so decoupled from Neptune's shove that they look untethered. In a solar system ruled by the giant planets, they act like they answer to someone else. Bring in a distant heavyweight, and the geometry resolves. Their perihelia sit safely away from Neptune's reach. Their arguments of perihelion cluster, and their aphelia stretch into regions where only a far shepherd can matter. Non-intuitive arrangements suddenly turn into a clean, if unsettling set of consequences. If something that large lives out there, why haven't we seen it? Distance strips brightness to almost nothing. At hundreds to more than 1,000 astronomical units, reflected sunlight becomes a whisper. Motion across the sky becomes so slow that smearing frames over months hardly shows drift against the starfield. Many sky surveys avoid swaths near the galactic plane because the background is too crowded. The possible orbit passes through those blind spots. Even when sensors stare right at it, the planet's slow crawl can masquerade as a static point, a faint dot among millions. That's the quiet joke inside the name debate. Astronomers speak of Planet 9, or even the more guarded the Planet Hypothesis. They avoid an older label that drags a great deal of baggage. They stick to mass ranges, eccentricities and perihelia. They talk about survey footprints and detection thresholds. It reads clinical by design. To some ears, the language feels like a scrubbed script, the story told with edges shaved down so it fits inside a grant proposal. From the outside, a different storyline forms. If there was ever a plan to manage public reaction to a world that repeats on a long cycle, one way to defuse panic would be to pin a very long period on it, one so long that no living person needs to worry. Talk about 10 to 20,000 years, not about a near future return. Keep the model in the realm of the abstract. Let the numbers reassure. High inclination, extreme aphelion, slow motion, tiny flux. It becomes a clean academic pursuit rather than a clock. But the uneasy part is the convergence. Take the specifics one by one: a mass in the super-Earth to mini-Neptune range, an orbit inclined enough to explain a system-wide tilt, a long perihelion beyond the main Kuiper population, a suite of predictions that later observations actually find. None of that requires myth. It does, however, create a shape that looks familiar to anyone who has spent time with old stories about a long, slow, high-inclination intruder that reorganises the outer dark and leaves signatures inside that parallel sits there, uninvited, while the mathematics stands on its own. A separate question is practical. How do you catch a thing like this? You need a survey that covers wide sky quickly and reaches faint magnitudes with regular cadence so slow movement shows up as movement. You need software that doesn't throw away stationary points before checking parallax over long baselines. You need to be comfortable digging near the galactic plane where the background noise is worst, and you need patience measured in seasons and years, not nights. Several programs have taken bites at the problem and found nothing. That word, nothing, doesn't carry the weight people think it does. It often means not here, not now, not bright enough. Some argue the observed clustering might be an artifact of where we've looked. Survey bias can create illusions if you only fish certain waters. The counterclaim is that independent surveys with different footprints keep reporting similar alignments, and that the model made testable forecasts that later passed. This is where the debate lives now. On the boundary between small number statistics and a hypothesis that explains multiple puzzles with one mass on the board, you can hear the caution in the tone on both sides. No one wants to declare victory too early. Few want to ignore a tool that cleans up multiple messes at once. Meanwhile, the vocabulary game continues. The avoidance of loaded names serves a simple purpose: keep the focus on data. Yet that avoidance also feeds a quieter talk track that sees the institution is laundering an older narrative into a palatable research program. In that view, the workshop terms and the careful phrasing act as a pressure valve. The public hears about a distant, cold, long-period object whose danger is merely theoretical, and the anxiety stays low. There's no need to rush underground or build arcs if the return takes longer than recorded history. Even if you set that aside, the core story stays strange. Two researchers tried to falsify a pattern and end up refining a candidate with mass, inclination, eccentricity, and period. The candidate doesn't show itself. It leaves a field of aligned debris, a tilt in the plane, and a set of oddballs orbiting at right angles where they shouldn't exist. Each time a survey fills another patch of sky, the box narrows. Each time a null detection comes back, the orbit adjusts. It's a slow chase, conducted mostly in code and in the dim light of control rooms. The search will lean hard on new instruments with deeper reach and faster cadence. That's where faint, slow movers betray themselves. If the planet sits in a crowded field, it will take careful difference imaging to tease out its motion. If it's cooler and darker than expected, the albedo assumptions in brightness estimates will matter. If dust or a ring system dims it further, the object that is already too faint becomes almost a rumour. Still, gravity doesn't lie. If a mass is there, its trail through the orbital architecture won't stop showing up. For some, that's where the meaning lies. Not in the name, not in the myth, but in the way mathematics can point to a world you can't see yet. For others, it's the resonance with older cycles that keeps the hair on the back of the neck up. A tilted, stretched path that takes ages to return overlaps with a certain category of story, even if the periods don't line up. The temptation to connect them is human. The The discipline to keep them apart is scientific. In practice, both impulses coexist in the same conversation. If the proposal stays strictly inside astronomy, the next step looks simple. Keep calculating, keep surveying, publish updates, wait for a light source to move against the stars in the right way. That's the polite version. But a few decades ago, a different kind of detection made a brief appearance, and the reaction didn't look like patient science. It looked like something that enters the room and then quickly leaves, with a trail of confusion and a long echo. January 1983. NASA and its partners switch on a new kind of eye in space, the Infrared Astronomical Satellite, IRAS. It doesn't look for starlight, it looks for heat. That one shift matters, because cold, dark objects that barely reflect visible light still glow in infrared. Ground-based telescopes miss them. IRAS was built to find them. For the first time, a satellite can sweep the entire sky for faint thermal signatures from dust-shrouded stars, newborn solar systems, and potentially large, cold bodies far beyond Neptune. The mission is a collaboration among the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands, and its instruments give astronomers a way to map what the optical surveys leave out. In the early passes, the detectors fill with sources: cosmic dust clouds, protostars, distant galaxies, but mixed among them are a small number of bright cold spots that don't fit the catalogue large. Nearby, not obviously stellar, not obviously galaxies, not obviously debris, anomalies. Engineers and scientists begin cross-checking the detections. Infrared sources can trick even experienced teams. Cold galaxies can blend into single points. Cirrus-like dust in our own galaxy can mimic compact objects, and asteroids can flare and fade along their orbits. Still, the flag detections don't settle down into easy categories. They persist as outliers in a survey designed to be systematic. More scans follow. The team refines coordinates and correlates sky patches with known catalogues. Some outliers match distant structures, others do not. Inside the mission groups, the discussion shifts from "what is this wavelength telling us?" to "what kind of object could stay this cold, this bright, and this close?" Then December 30th, 1983 hits the public. The Washington Post runs a front-page story. Possibly as large as Jupiter, mystery heavenly body discovered. It cites IRAS results, points to the constellation Orion, and quotes the project's chief scientist, Dr. Gary Neugebauer. "All I can tell you is that we don't know what it is." That line lands hard. The article frames the detection as a candidate for a massive nearby object, possibly Jupiter-sized, picked up by heat rather than reflected light. Within hours, the piece ricochets across wire services, evening news, radio commentary. For years, people had whispered about a hidden giant, now an infrared telescope purpose-built to reveal cold wanderers, appears to have found something that fits. Planet X believers read the headline as confirmation astronomers, cautious but curious, reopen old files on long-shot searches. Editors call observatories for statements. Forums and late-night programs throw around the words planet, companion, and brown dwarf with equal ease. For a short window, speculation moves faster than caution. That kind of candidate, big, cold, nearby, would naturally glow in IRA's bands. The story gains momentum because the physics are simple enough for the public to follow. A dark planet can still be bright in heat. The sky location in Orion adds to the allure. It's a well-known region rich in star-forming dust and complex backgrounds, yet the reported detection isn't waved away as ordinary nebula structure. The framing implies an object against that luminous backdrop that refuses to melt into it. Phone lines at the mission offices stay busy. Reporters want certainty, broadcasters want names and distances. If this is a planet, where is it? How far? How fast? And how did every optical survey miss it? Then the brakes slam. Within about 2 days, a round of clarifications comes out. NASA officials emphasize that the early sources likely include distant galaxies or clumped interstellar dust. The Jupiter interpretation, they say, leans too hard on preliminary data. The narrative narrows. The mysterious signature can be explained. The team never claimed a planet. The quote about not knowing was accurate, but not a declaration of a new world. The tone shifts from possibility to housekeeping. By this point, the public already latched onto the original framing, so the reversal lands with a thud. How do you go from a potential Jupiter-sized object to probably galaxies so quickly? Why was the initial statement confident enough to greenlight a headline, and the follow-up firm enough to put the story back in the drawer? Inside the conspiracy community, the gap between those two moves becomes the story. The reclassification reads like a rehearsed pivot. First, let the idea out. Second, smother it with ambiguity. The speed raises questions. Infrared detections can be messy, but reinterpreting unprecedented sources in 48 hours seems aggressive. If the object was truly unmodelled, large, cold, nearby, careful follow-up would take time, repeated scans and independent checks. Instead, the explanation flips quickly to distant galaxies and interstellar clouds, even though the original reporting centred on a candidate that didn't match those templates. When the public asks for coordinates or follow-on observations, the answer's thin-out interest moves on. The narrative resets. We know from internal planning discussions that infrared satellites are, by design, capable of detecting undiscovered planets or brown dwarfs. Those capabilities were not an accident. Teams anticipated that possibility and talked about what a nearby dark companion would mean for astronomy and public communication. That preparedness feeds a later suspicion. If the system finds exactly what it was built to find, a massive, cold body, what happens next? The argument from Cover-Up goes like this. A detection matching Planet X expectations would trigger a response protocol, push the data into restricted channels, and reframe the story before the public locks onto the implications. The thing to watch isn't the first headline, it's the untraceable silence afterward. That is where the allegations climb. Researchers who study the incident point to the cascade of reclassifications. First, a Jupiter-sized unknown in a well-defined patch. Then, perhaps not planetary. Then, likely distant galaxies. Later, alternative identifications or no strong identification at all. And again, a reminder that the instrument was well suited to spot what the original report described. Each flip adds friction. It becomes hard to tell whether the catalogues absorbed the anomaly or the anomaly was simply relabeled until it stopped making noise. Inconsistent explanations make fertile ground. If the source was a galaxy, the coordinates should settle it. If it was a dust cloud, later maps should show the structure. In both cases, the simple, definitive closure never takes hold in the public space where the story first exploded. The technical side offers both clarity and cover. Infrared astronomy is complicated. Point spread functions smear light. Background cirrus can mimic sources. Detector artifacts produce ghost signals. Crossband correlation is tough when sources are cold enough to be bright at some wavelengths and nearly invisible at others. All of that is legitimate. It also makes it easy to drown a unique object in a sea of could-bes. When people ask, "Did you find a cold large body near the solar system?" the honest answer requires a careful checklist, and that gives institutions room to manage timing and tone. The retraction doesn't need to be a lie to function as a firewall. It only needs to be fast and authoritative. As the months pass, the public memory of the 1983 spike fades into a handful of citations and forum posts. Meanwhile, the mission moves on to rich scientific returns, all sky infrared maps, new galaxies, star formation catalogues. The puzzling sources that spark the headline get folded into general releases or vanish into technical notes. In community discussions, a strange consensus forms. Yes, the early coverage was dramatic. Yes, the walk back was swift. No, there was never a clean final identification everyone could point to. That limbo keeps the event alive decades later. Even astronomers who dismiss Planet X narratives admit the press arc was odd. Loud claim, quick reversal, lingering ambiguity. It doesn't help that IRAS-era objects have been reclassified more than once. An emission peak tagged as a galaxy one year becomes a blend of galaxies the next as surveys sharpen. A supposed cloud resolves into filaments and point sources with better instruments. That's normal science. But when the first public note ties one of those peaks to a nearby massive object, the subsequent shuffle reads like shell game optics. Swap labels enough times, and the public stops asking which cup hides the ball. The lingering effect is distrust. If the sky is so well mapped, why can't anyone close the book on that December detection? The enduring mystery rests on that friction. We still don't have a universally accepted specific identification of the mystery heavenly body that launched the headline. We do have a record of retractions, contradictions, and shifts in wording. We also have the broader context. Infrared capabilities that could, in principle, reveal undiscovered planets or brown dwarfs, and internal awareness of the social weight such a discovery would carry. Put together, it's easy to see why the 1983 episode remains a pillar in Planet X lore. It looks like a dry run of what disclosure and denial would look like in practice. 1 foot on the gas, then 2 feet on the brakes. For believers, the simplest reading is the most appealing. IRAS saw exactly what off-the-books researchers had predicted, a massive, cold body on the fringes, and the system shut the door. For skeptics, the case is weaker than it looks. Preliminary detections, misinterpretations by the press, and legitimate reanalysis turned a routine cataloguing problem into a headline that refused to die. Yet even the skeptical take struggles with the speed and certainty of the reversal compared to the uncertainty that followed. If the fix was that easy, why didn't the fix stick? The 1983 incident still hangs over any discussion of hidden giants. It established the media template and the institutional reflexes we continue to see. Initial openness framed as mystery, then consolidation around safer explanations, then a haze of technicalities that never quite resolves the original claim. And history suggests one person refused to file it away as an error. While officials moved on, a well-placed astronomer kept digging into the math in the sky, convinced there was more to find. His pursuit would end abruptly, right as he prepared to present his strongest case. Meet Robert Sutton Harrington the way his colleagues knew him. A quiet precisionist who could turn a tangle of orbital residuals into navigational certainty. As chief astronomer at the US Naval Observatory, he didn't chase headlines. He kept satellites on track and clocks honest, the kind of work that leaves no room for guesswork. He lived in the numbers, perturbations, ephemerids, reference frames, and his reputation rested on getting difficult math right under pressure. If a planet's predicted position didn't match the sky, he wanted to know why the sky disagreed. That impulse put him on a path few establishment astronomers dared to walk by the late 20th century. The problem he tackled was old and stubborn. Even after Pluto entered the charts and mass estimates were revised, tiny irregularities in Uranus and Neptune refused to flatten into tidy prediction. Most researchers chalked the remaining noise up to measurement error, historical data quality, or modelling limitations that would vanish as observations improved. Harrington wasn't satisfied with shrugging at residuals. He revisited the mechanics, recalculated parameters, and looked for a consistent gravitational explanation. The outer solar system, with its long periods and sparse observations, rewards patience. He had that in abundance. The equation suggested a distant perturber could still be playing a role, even if the textbooks had largely closed the Planet X chapter. He moved carefully. First came the internal memos and computations, then proposals that outlined how a massive object at high inclination and great distance might gently tug the giant planets in ways that accumulated over decades. This wasn't a dramatic deviation. It was the faint, insistent fingerprint you see only when you subtract everything else. He examined alternate masses, trial orbits, and the effect of different longitudes of perihelion. The solution space kept pointing south, toward regions of sky that southern hemisphere observatories could sweep more efficiently than the northern facilities he usually worked with. It was an unwelcome result, only in the logistical sense. Then came a move no one expected from a man so firmly inside the establishment. He reached out to Zecharia Sitchin. The contact wasn't an endorsement of ancient astronauts, genetic projects, or doomsday cycles. It was a targeted comparison. Harrington had a southward-leaning mathematical solution, and Sitchin had long argued for a world approaching from the southern sky. Putting their maps side by side was a test of overlap, not belief. The conversation bridged two separate universes, one operating on peer-reviewed orbit fits, the other on interpretations of Akkadian vocabulary and mythic cycles. Yet on the simple question of approach direction and search region, there was more agreement than either camp expected. Harrington kept his skepticism about myth, but didn't throw away data that lined up. His preliminary configurations included orbits that would keep a large body distant for most of its period, slow-moving and dim, but still heavy enough to explain subtle drifts in planetary longitudes. The inclination he modelled steered attention to constellations crawling close to the southern celestial pole. He began drafting a campaign, where to point telescopes, how long to integrate, what background sources to subtract in infrared, and which small survey windows could maximise the odds of spotting a faint slow mover against crowded star fields. By then, the Planet X banner had become a career hazard. Many colleagues had concluded there was nothing more to find after Pluto's demotion from Uranus fixer to outlier. He understood the political weather and walked into it anyway. He didn't claim a detection. He claimed that the residuals merited a structured search and that the hypothesis remained testable. That stance, in a field wary of repeating early 20th century detours, left him increasingly alone. The professional risk didn't slow him, it sharpened his materials. He recorded interviews that laid out his reasoning without flourish. He showed the steps, the sensitivity checks, the boundary conditions that would falsify his model. His schedule condensed. He assembled what he called a final pass for a major presentation that would line up his orbital fits, candidate sky sectors, and a practical roadmap for instrument time. The focus was on method, not spectacle. Photographic plate comparisons, slow drift differential measurements, and multi-epoch strategies that catch a cold object inching across a dense star background. He discussed parallax baselines, thermal emission estimates at extreme distances, and the value of pairing optical with infrared sweeps to avoid mistaking background galaxies for faint solar system members. He wasn't promising a discovery. He was delivering a way to stop arguing and start looking. Then the interruption arrived fast and merciless. In 1993, he received a diagnosis that left no runway. Esophageal cancer moved through a healthy 52-year-old with brutal speed treatment began while his notes remained midstream. Margins filled with candidate coordinates, sky coverage charts, and revisions marked in precise hands. The presentation he intended to deliver stalled at the edge of completion. Within months, he was gone. The work on Planet X at the Naval Observatory went quiet. The institutional files closed on a subject that, for him, had not yet exhausted its questions. The timing became part of the story. His exchange with Sitchin had occurred the year before. His search plan targeted southern skies that fit both his equations and the outsider's narrative. He had consolidated years of calculations into a set of coordinates and proposals. And then, just as he was set to argue his case with full documentation, he vanished from the field. For those already watchful for patterns, the sequence looked deliberate. For others, it was a cruel coincidence compounded by the sudden halt of official interest. Either way, curiosity found only silence where a data-driven push had been gathering momentum. What remains on record points to a prediction that now looks uncomfortably familiar. The mass range he considered, the elongated orbit, the inclination that steps outside the plane, and the approach geometry towards southern constellations echo what later models would propose under a different name. He didn't have a digitally stitched sky from modern wide-field surveys, nor the computational power now routine in orbital simulations. He had patience, classic mechanics, and a willingness to keep a minority hypothesis alive because the math hadn't killed it. The longer the hunt went on, the more a quiet suspicion crept in. The tug on those far-flung objects might not belong to a hidden planet at all. The math doesn't care about names, it only cares about mass and distance, and when the numbers refuse to settle, researchers start opening doors they'd rather keep closed. The gravitational fingerprints beyond Neptune could be coming from something stranger than a wandering super-Earth, something that doesn't reflect sunlight the way a planet does, or even shine like a normal star. Here's the uncomfortable baseline. Across our galaxy, stars prefer company. Binaries are common, triples are not rare. Lone stars like ours are the minority, not the rule. That fact keeps nagging at the edges of this mystery. If most suns form with companions, did ours once have one too? Or does it still? Astronomers consider how a dim partner, faint enough to slip past optical surveys, could still shape the outer architecture of our system over deep time. It wouldn't need to be close, it would only need to be steady and heavy, circling far out where the cold bites and orbital periods stretch into millions of years. That is where the Nemesis idea enters. Not a comic book villain, but a proposal born to explain patterns that look cyclical when you stack them against Earth's deep past. A companion star would move on a long ellipse, spending most of its time in the dark outskirts, then sweeping closer on schedule. Not close to us, but close enough to stir the Oort cloud, that distant sphere of icy bodies circling far beyond Pluto. A small nudge out there becomes a rain of comets in here, delayed but predictable. The kind of event that leaves scars in strata and signatures in fossils. That mechanism does not require mystery planets or sudden miracles, only gravity doing its slow work. If such a companion exists, a brown dwarf is a plausible suspect. These are the in-between objects, bigger than giant planets, too light to ignite sustained fusion. They glow mostly in infrared, which means optical telescopes can scan the sky right over them and never notice. Their temperatures sit low, their spectra are sparse, their motion is glacial against the star field, yet their mass is real, and mass moves things. A brown dwarf out in the dark could shepherd comet reservoirs, tilt orbital planes, and scrape the edges of the Kuiper Belt over tens of millions of years. Infrared sky maps have found many brown dwarfs in our neighbourhood, but surveys are incomplete, especially toward crowded stellar backgrounds and low galactic latitudes. A slow, cold body on a huge orbit could evade detection for decades. The logic gains force when you lay it over extinction studies. Paleontologists have argued about apparent rhythms in the fossil record, windows where die-offs cluster, as if something pressed a cosmic reset on a schedule a distant companion would not kill by heat or radiation. It would kill by triggering inbound debris. You would expect pulses, long quiet stretches, then a spike in impacts, dust loading the stratosphere, ecosystems stumbling. If the orbit stretches over tens of millions of years, the cadence would sit in that same range. The match is not proof, but it is a testable pattern, and patterns keep this conversation alive. Of course, a companion star is not the only exotic candidate on the table. Some researchers have asked a bolder question. What if the unseen culprit is a primordial black hole? These are hypothesized relics from the first instance after the Big Bang, formed not by dying stars but by density spikes in the infant universe. They could be tiny in size and massive in weight, planetary mass squeezed into something no bigger than a grapefruit. They emit no light. They reflect nothing. Their presence announces itself only through gravity. In that case, you wouldn't spot a disk or a glow. You'd look for micro-lensing events when the object passes in front of a distant star and briefly magnifies its light, or for outbursts when it eats a piece of wandering debris. Both are rare, both require patience, and both could be missed if the search window is narrow. There's a third lane that avoids compact objects entirely: dark matter clumps. Dark matter remains a placeholder term for something that outweighs visible matter in the universe, yet refuses to interact with light. If small-scale clumps exist within our galaxy, one could drift through the outskirts of our system. It would flow through planets like fog, but its mass would still tug. The footprint would look like a gravitational breeze, subtle, persistent, and hard to pin on any luminous source. You wouldn't see it, but you might infer it if enough distant objects precess in unison, or if their perihelia cluster where simple dynamics say they shouldn't. What makes these ideas sticky is how they echo old writings in a way that is hard to ignore without overselling it. Egyptian texts include passages about a companion to the sun, not as metaphor, but as a feature of the sky's order. Certain Gnostic lines speak of an invisible star that governs fate, a body that rules yet hides. In indigenous traditions, the purifier arrives at the end of an age, revealing itself only when cycles close. None of this functions as data in a modern sense. It does, however, show that the human imagination has long made room for a presence that is both central and unseen, fiery in consequence and dark in appearance. That same overlap shows up in fringe texts like the Kolbrin, where the destroyer returns at intervals, bringing red skies, burning stones, and water that turns bitter. You don't have to accept the source to see the mechanism. Comet showers alter atmospheres. Fine dust scatters sunlight toward red. Fragments heat in air and fall, as fire impacts churn oceans onto coasts and seed them with metals. A brown dwarf pass could disturb reservoirs and restore calm when it recedes, leaving myths to hold the memory of cause and effect in the language available at the time. Turn back to the lab, and the practical issues define the chase. A brown dwarf close enough to shape the Oort cloud on cycle times, matching the fossil record, might still sit so far out that its motion across the sky takes decades to notice its brightness would live deep in the infrared, and our past all-sky infrared maps carry gaps and noise. A primordial black hole would be worse. No emission, no reflection, only a statistical chance to catch a lensing blip that lasts hours or days and never repeats. Dark matter clumps bring their own headaches because they are defined by what they don't do. They don't radiate, they don't clump in disks, they don't leave anything you can point a telescope at. You would need to build a case by accumulating orbital oddities and showing that a single mass distribution explains them cleanly. Skeptics push back hard. Binary stars are common, yes, but not universal. Our sun could be one of the genuine singles. Infrared surveys like WISE have placed firm limits on brown dwarfs larger than a given mass within a given distance, squeezing the parameter space for any companion capable of major mischief. Periodic extinction claims shift under fresh data. What looks like a clean rhythm often fades with new fossil discoveries. Primordial black holes carry strong constraints from microlensing campaigns and the cosmic microwave background. Dark matter clumps at the right scale are speculative and lack a firm theoretical anchor. Those critiques prune the wild growth, but they don't negate the base observation. Something is organising those distant orbits, and ordinary explanations struggle. Meanwhile, the cultural parallels keep stacking. Egyptian hymns describe a second presence linked to the sun yet separate from it. Gnostic lore elevates an unseen mover as a force that writes destinies. Hopi teachings hold a purifier that appears near the end of a cycle, not as a metaphor for personal change, but as a sky sign. These echoes don't validate a physics model, but they do explain why certain models feel intuitive to people reading ancient material through a modern lens. When scientific possibilities line up with archetypal expectations, belief takes root faster, and skepticism feels like denial rather than caution. Let's fold the options back together. a brown dwarf companion addresses the binary star norm and offers a clear path for periodic comet storms. A primordial black hole slips past every optical net and still gives you the mass budget to bend remote orbits. A dark matter clump answers the demand for a force that is there and not there at once, leaving no glow, only geometry. Each one covers a different piece of the anomaly set while matching those old descriptions of an object that burns the world without shining like a star, that rules cycles without standing in the open. The models disagree on origin, detectability, and side effects. They converge on the notion that the force at work could be invisible in the ordinary sense. If any of these invisible giants were to drift inward along a path that grazes our domain, the effects would not read like myth. They would unroll as physics. A brown dwarf's gravity would tilt the comet reservoirs and light up the inner system with long-period visitors, seeds for impact chains. A primordial black hole passing through the outer debris fields could scatter objects with pinpoint encounters while remaining optically silent, making detection a race against rare lensing spikes. A dense dark matter clump intersecting the heliosphere could tweak orbital phases without leaving a trace in any camera, the signature written only in the slow shuffle of dozens of icy orbits. Which means the stakes of the hunt run deeper than cataloguing a ninth planet. They touch the architecture of our history and the triggers that punctuate it. If an unseen partner to the sun sets the clock, or a mass with no light hides on a leash we have yet to trace, then the next chapter of this story won't be announced by mythic omens. It will be logged by instruments, modelled on servers, and felt here through the exact same forces that built the anomalies in the first place. And if that present swings close enough to matter, the chain of consequences will look less like legend and more like a mechanistic sequence that our most dire traditions only approximated with symbols and fire. You don't need a direct hit for the sky to end. A massive body can pass at a distance and do the job with gravity alone. That reaches the real weapon, an arm stretching across millions of miles, plucking at orbits like strings until the music of the solar system turns into noise. The damage begins long before anyone on Earth notices. First come the tiny errors no one can see without years of data. Numbers that drift, predictions that stop lining up, models that fit perfectly until they don't. By the time we recognise the pattern has moved on. At the edge, Neptune breaks rhythm. Its orbit shifts by fractions of a degree, small enough to miss in a single run, big enough to accumulate. Astronomers argue about whether it's bias or instrument drift, then find the same offsets in independent datasets. Uranus doesn't help. It wiggles in the wrong direction at the wrong time, not by much, but consistently enough to prune away comfortable explanations. These aren't dramatic changes. They're the kind you only see by subtracting one century from another and watching the residue that refuses to vanish. That residue is the first warning. Out past Neptune, far-flung debris starts to fall out of line. The gravitational sweep from the intruder nudges orbits into resonances, and the system answers. The Kuiper Belt thins in regions that should be crowded while other regions thicken into strange traffic patterns. Distant objects stretch into longer ellipses. Some grow so detached that Neptune's influence no longer accounts for their paths. None of this looks like an attack. It looks like tidying. Then the broom hits something brittle. The asteroid belt wakes up. Jupiter's long-standing hold is no longer the only hand in the game. Resonances shift by hairs and begin to amplify. Swarms of small bodies get kicked slightly higher, slightly lower, slightly faster. Most miss everything. A few don't. The inner system sees more near-Earth objects on unusual tracks. Meteor rates creep up. Fireballs become weekly instead of monthly in some skywatching records. People notice streaks. News segments run clips of dash cams. It still feels like a curiosity. It isn't. The first human-scale signs arrive out of sync with the weather. Harbour workers see morning tides arriving hours early, then receding too far. Coastal pilots report strange cross-currents cutting against known channels. Tide tables, those quiet calendars that have never been wrong, start needing corrections in pencil, then in thick marker inland, compasses grow unreliable. Surveyors who trust magnetics start carrying extra gear, then stop trusting anything that points north pavement buckles in places with no heavy traffic. At night, the sky shows more glittering scratches, sometimes with low rumbles that people argue are jets until the jets are grounded. The moon begins to wobble. It's subtle at first, an argument in the decimals of laser ranging, then not subtle at all. The timing of eclipses drifts in ways that don't match known cycles. Tidal amplitude spikes in one bay and vanishes in another. Storm surges arrive on clear days. Fishermen tie off to no avail, as twice-a-month tides turn into twice-a-week surprises. In flood zones, salt water creeps upriver and sits on farmland. Drainage systems designed for a known pattern face a pattern that refuses to hold steady. For more than a few days, insurance tables fail. Coastal cities begin moving pumps, then barricades, then substations. None of it keeps up. Earth's axial tilt jitters. A fraction of a degree sounds harmless until you multiply it across an atmosphere. Weather cells shift lanes. Jet streams split and rejoin, dragging heat and cold into the wrong places for the wrong lengths of time. Crops that need reliable seasons start missing their windows by weeks. Regions built for mild winters get flash freezes without a front. Power grids strain through back-to-back heat domes and out-of-season cold snaps. People blame climate models and politics. The cause doesn't care. Underfoot, stress redistributes. Fault systems that have slept for decades speak up with tremor swarms. The pattern looks less like a single rupture and more like a network under load. Plates grumble. Subduction zones that creep begin to hop. Bridges designed for known spectra face shakes just off the charts they were tuned to. In some places, the ground liquefies. Skyscrapers that handled previous earthquakes with grace take damage from a month of persistent mid-sized shocks that never let surfaces recover. Reservoirs slosh hard enough to threaten dams. Evacuation orders overlap until maps become noise. Volcano systems respond next. Some only steam more often, others escalate. Caldera complexes long watched by a small circle of geophysicists show new deformation, fresh injection of magma, and gas signatures that belong deeper than they used to. Yellowstone's hydrothermal basins rearrange themselves. Campiflegre groans upward by inches, then falls, then rises again, cracking stucco across entire neighbourhoods. Taupo's lake rolls under winds that don't exist. Authorities issue statements about preparedness while quietly widening exclusion zones, moving sensors and stockpiling masks. Ash advisories become tools you keep open on your phone like a radar app. The magnetosphere starts to flicker. Auroras slip down to latitudes that have never seen them. Night skies glow above desert towns with no source to explain the colour. Airlines reroute not for weather, but for charged skies that interfere with comms. Power stations install new grounding to handle geomagnetically induced currents, then watch transformers overheat anyway. On bad days, satellites stall into safe mode en masse. GPS goes sloppy. Farm equipment fails in fields. Container ships drift outside harbours waiting for a clear signal. The data loss cascades into industries that never plan to do math by hand again. Hospitals switch to backup records. Trading floors go quiet on emergency halts more times in 1 year than in the previous decade. With the magnetosphere compromised, solar wind digs in. Radiation levels creep upward at higher altitudes and, on bad days, at ground level near the poles. Airlines cut polar routes, then cut flights. Crews see more cataracts. A handful of cosmic ray-induced single-event upsets become a stream that flips bits in avionics and medical devices. The news cycle jumps between rare sky show and unexpected outage. Neither label helps when grid nodes black out in sequence after a coronal mass ejection. that would have been annoying 10 years ago becomes a city killer now. The intruder's pull continues to climb. Ocean basins feel it. Standing waves set up in places that have no names for them, then migrate. A blue highway goes the wrong direction. Coastal flood maps grow useless as shorelines redraw themselves not with water levels, but with hydraulic rhythms no engineer has modelled. Old marshes reappear where concrete sat dry for generations. Barrier islands erode on their lee sides. Ports that defined trade routes for centuries can't hold ships anymore. Then the crust slides. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but in blocks large enough to turn geography into rumour. The lithosphere loses traction against the mantle and shifts in fits continental margins pivot. What was north by northeast becomes east in a week. Mountain ranges flare as fault scarp after fault scarp throws rock into new angles. The stress screams through subduction zones as slabs jerk. Tsunami walls help once, then not at all. Waves roll, not as single fronts, but as trains dozens deep, stacked to the height of towers, swallowing sea walls and airports, rolling across ground you used to call inland. In river deltas, water moves inland and never leaves. Cities die in stages. First the ports, then the power, then the water. Supply chains break on hazards you cannot detour around because there's no safe map. Warehouses flood with salt and silt. Refineries shut down for lack of clean intake. Data centres lose cooling water, then power, then backups hospitals ration oxygen, and abandoned sections when generators burn out. Evacuations meet roads that don't exist anymore. Helicopters run out of fuel with nowhere to land. Wealth helps for a week, then not at all. Ash joins the story. A major caldera goes, then a second. The stratosphere loads with particulates. Daylight drops by a margin you feel in your bones. Growing zones crash south and stall. Harvests fail 2 seasons in a row. Grain prices go from bad to desperate. People move inland for safety and find the soil cold and the water wrong. Wild fisheries collapse under reorganised currents. Plastic greenhouses go up across valleys and melt in a single windstorm loaded with superheated ash. Radiation finds gaps in the shields we built. The magnetosphere's weakness turns a solar maximum into a hazard you can't buffer with technology. Satellite replacements fail faster than they launch. Long-haul communications reduce to, then rely on systems we retired decades ago. The internet fractures into islands that talk locally, and only occasionally to each other. Space agencies lose probes to silent void, not from impact, but because noise overwhelms the guidance and power budgets we designed under a gentler sky. The attrition is the point. This isn't a single day. It's a long grind of bad weeks where you never reset to normal. You adapt to unpredictable tides and then the ground moves. You adapt to rolling blackouts and then ash falls for 2 months. You adapt to new planting calendars and then the season shifts again. Every fix solves the last pattern and fails on the next one. Entire professions become field triage. Teachers learn to hold class at noon because mornings are dark. Bakers learn to run ovens at night because the grid holds. Then parents memorise the sound of infrastructure failing in the distance. Governments respond as they can. Some hold until the first crustal slip. Others fail under 3 years of high prices and failed harvests. Emergency powers become regular law. Borders close to avoid taking in millions of coastal refugees, then open when inland cities empty after water tables turn brackish. The market value of farmland rises in places with windbreaks and groundwater, then collapses when a new tilt redirects rain. Cash means less than access to stable microgrids, seed libraries, and uncorrupted maps. The most reliable currency is quiet, skills that keep neighbourhoods fed, clean and connected. The end state is a planet reset without any mythic flourish. Just physics applied over time. Skies dim for years. Radiation remains a background fact. Oceans hold new shapes and priorities. The tilt settles into an angle that wasn't on our schoolroom posters. Days lengthen or shorten by a slice you feel when dawn doesn't land where it used to. Ecosystems crash, then reassemble from the scraps that endure wind, cold, salt, and heat. Large animals move or die. Insects fill niches until something bigger returns. Forests become mosaics of hardy species spaced by fire breaks and flood scars. Coral bleaches beyond recall. The map stabilizes eventually, but it's a different Earth with a memory of the old one buried under mud and ash. Survivors build in the gaps. Towns organise around springs and sheltered valleys. Food grows under cover. Power hums from micro-turbines and rooftop arrays instead of distant plants. The baseline for a good year is simple. No ash for months, steady tides and quiet ground. Calendars change because the sky demanded it. Stories change because people need to explain the long season of noise and the silence that followed. Children learn an astronomy of absence. What used to be visible and what now speaks only through the way the wind curves or the tide leans. So when you ask why the reports are vague, why the maps don't agree, and why the announcements sound like cautions instead of facts, remember the scale. If this is what a single passage can do, if a hidden mass can lean on our world and make it bow without ever touching it, what leader would stand at a podium and say the quiet parts out loud? We grow up thinking governments are guardians, that their first duty is to inform and protect. That story lasts until you see how states actually react to threats they can't control. When survival of the system is on the line, the priority flips. Stability first, truth later, if ever. It's not about malice as much as function. A complex structure preserves itself. That's the operating system. And when the threat lives in the sky, beyond any political leverage, you get a strategic silence wrapped in routine statements and delayed reports. What matters is continuity, not transparency. So bring it into a room. A folder sits on the desk. The seal is read. A liaison lays out what astronomers whispered for months. An object, cold and massive, moving on an orbit nobody logged in the public catalogues. We found something. Notice how fast the conversation shifts from astronomy to outcomes. It's not what is it anymore. It's what happens if we tell people. These meetings become logistics, not philosophy. Who needs to know, who doesn't, and how to keep society from storing up panic. You storyboard the next 72 hours like a crisis film and markets open at 9:30. By 10:15, indexes are down double digits. By noon, credit freezes. By sunset, trucking firms suspend long-haul routes because insurance won't cover vehicles amid civil unrest forecasts. You start to see why silence is a policy, not an accident. Disclosure in plain language would shred the fabric instantly. Within hours, banks would face runs, ATMs would bleed out, retail workers would walk because a wage next Friday doesn't matter if next year might not happen, police would thin. Not because they're cowards, but because their families come first. Supply chains don't wobble gently, they snap. A chip factory sits idle because one rare gas shipment misses customs by a day that ripples right into hospital ventilators and food processing lines. Add to that the hard edge of law. If money loses meaning, contracts die. If contracts die, enforcement evaporates. Roads jam, fuel is hoarded, and the fragile trust that keeps the system humming gets replaced by survival math. Then you drill down into infrastructure. If you run a nuclear plant and you read a classified bulletin implying an elevated risk horizon, measured in years, not decades, how long do you stay at your post? A few leave, and others must work double shifts. Fatigue grows, safety margins narrow. Water systems require chemicals refilled on precise schedules. One supplier stops and you start rationing. Air traffic control can't take attrition without cascading delays that become ground stops. It's not the dramatic scenes that break a civilization. It's 1,000 tiny abstentions that add up to paralysis. Governments know these failure modes. Keeping confidence intact is as vital as any power grid. To control confidence, you control information. Space agencies are science outfits, yes, but they are also interface points with defense and intelligence. Data pipelines don't beam raw feeds to the public. They move through filtration layers, quality checks, classification screens. Not every flag triggers secrecy, but the system exists for edge cases. A long orbital object with uncertain parameters is an edge case. The milestone isn't a press conference. It's an internal threshold where the risk of panic outweighs the benefit of openness. The public gets cleaned maps, bland wording, and more time built into the cadence than the telemetry requires. That lag isn't laziness, it's by design. The Iris episode sits at the centre of this argument for a reason. December 30th, 1983, the Washington Post runs Mystery Heavenly Body Discovered, and quotes the IRAS chief scientist, "All I can tell you is that we don't know what it is." That headline ricocheted everywhere. The retraction followed with a speed that still raises eyebrows. The object became distant galaxies or interstellar dust. Case closed. But the sequence, public shock, swift reframe, mapped perfectly onto containment logic. Not because the data suddenly clarified, but because letting that ambiguity float through a holiday news cycle risked uncontrolled narrative. The safer move, issue a mundane classification and move on. Whether the initial interpretation was off or not, the choreography told you the rule. Neutralize the story before it starts moving people. When you accept that continuity outranks disclosure, underground architecture makes sense. Continuity of government isn't myth, it's the backbone of state survival planning facilities carved into bedrock. Air filters built to run for decades, farms under lamps that never see the sun, water lines that draw from deep aquifers, machine shops that can fabricate their own spare parts, whole ecosystems designed to function without the surface. The public story calls them nuclear-era bunkers. Another layer frames them as selective arcs, not fairy tale vaults with gold bars and artworking cities sized for the bare minimum of a technical civilization. Engineers, physicians, power specialists, agronomists, comms, and a tight administrative cadre. Survival is resource math. You can't feed everyone, so you choose skill sets and seed stock. It's cold, but it's consistent with the idea that the state's survival functions trump public inclusion. From there, the theory escalates. If you believe there's a runway for a quiet exit, you start looking at aerospace through a different lens. Classified propulsion lines, budgets that vanish into black programs, persistent rumours of craft that don't fit public physics. Off-world housing isn't a science fiction set in this framing, it's a staging ground. You don't advertise lifeboats if you only built enough for the crew, so secrecy serves construction. The fewer eyes, the faster the timeline. And if the timeline ends in departure, disclosure becomes not just unlikely, but counterproductive. This logic slides easily into older claims about bloodlines and long-term stewardship. If key families hold custodial roles across generations, their incentives align with preservation over openness. Public panic threatens infrastructure. Infrastructure collapse threatens continuity. Continuity protects the line. You see how the loop closes, the iris pattern fits, the filtration systems fit, the bunkers fit, and the absence of any honest mass preparation program fits. The public gets preparedness pamphlets and seasonal storm PSAs parallel to that. Specialised procurement quietly stocks deep facilities with high-density rations, rare medical supplies, redundant comms, and seed libraries arranged by climate resilience and caloric yield. At the policy level, a threat like a distant massive object is the perfect candidate for permanent limbo. Not imminent, not harmless, just uncertain enough to justify classification, and flexible enough to hang budgets on protocols break the horizon into tiers: detection, validation, trajectory confidence, consequence modelling, and public posture. You can keep a program at Tier 2 for years. You can overfeed critics with noise while your sensors refine the orbit. You can commission independent reviews that confirm your caution. And if anyone leaks, you route it into the conspiracy sink, where it competes with outlandish claims and dies under weight of association. One reason this approach works is that panic isn't an abstract fear, it's a tested phenomenon. Reveal risk without agency, and people do one of three things: freeze, flee, or fight. None of those help a grid stay up. None help a hospital keep its staff. Information withers when it has no clear action pathway. Governments prefer to release threats alongside protocols. In this case, there is no realistic protocol for 8 billion people. There are only triage plans. That's why you won't see open admissions. Communication remains vague. Hints about long-period objects, ongoing surveys, and no cause for concern. The language is calibrated to keep the mental wheels attached. Look at funding flows to see the hidden contour. Investment into deep earth infrastructure spikes after certain internal assessments. Contracts show up for high-torque drills, high-efficiency air handling, modular nuclear generation that can run isolated hardened fibre routes, redundant satellite relays. Agriculture initiatives quietly acquire seed varieties optimised for low light and short cycles. University labs get grants pegged to resilience and continuity, rather than discovery. You can read the priorities in the purchasing orders. One layer further and you hit the breakaway thesis. If a separate technological track exists, fueled by black budgets and free of public oversight, it would pursue self-sufficiency and mobility. The endgame isn't to wait out a storm underground, it's to leave the storm behind. The wedge between that goal and any honest warning to the public is obvious. Panic complicates launch windows, supply chains, and secrecy. Calm preserves timelines, so the story remains flat even as the projects rise. This path leads to the darkest possibility, that the modern lattice of power descends from ancient custodianship. If the myth of returns is taken seriously by those networks, then every generation has one task: stay ready, stay hidden, keep the machinery intact, and protect your own. Viewed through that lens, the cover-up isn't a temporary policy, it's a civilizational doctrine. It answers the same way across centuries. Keep the sky quiet, keep the ground steady, and move only when the calculations say move. You don't need to accept every part of that to see why silence persists. Systems built for self-preservation silence disruptions, and nothing disrupts like a timeline that dwarfs governments, markets, and confidence at once. Whether the object is a planet, a dwarf star, or something that doesn't reflect light at all, the calculus at the top remains the same. Tell people, and you light the fuse. Don't tell them, and you might make it to the next quarter, the next election, the next phase of construction. Ethical debates shrink under that gravity. Which brings the question home. Even if the threat were overstated or misread, the myth of a hidden destroyer keeps returning because it serves a function. It organises fear. It gives shape to unease. Authorities treat it like volatility, smoothing it with press releases and shifting it into footnotes. They hope attention moves on, but it doesn't. It adapts, finds new evidence to cling to, new rumours to animate it, and new silences to interpret. The persistence itself is a data point, a sign that the story's roots lie deeper than any single object or agency. And that's where the next layer takes us. Not into another briefing room, but into the human need that keeps this constellation of secrecy and belief aligned long after the headlines fade. Here's the quiet turn no one expects. After all the math, the sky surveys, the clay tablets, Nibiru might be less of a thing out there and more of a lens inside us. The story keeps returning because it solves a problem we carry but rarely name. We live under rolling waves of change. Markets twitch, storms intensify, politics harden, technology rewrites the rules, and our minds look for a single hinge that makes the door swing. Nibiru becomes that hinge, a name for the pressure, a shape for a fear we can't localize. We follow it because it converts noise into signal. That persistence tells you something. It's not the strength of the evidence that keeps the story alive. It's the relief the story provides. When everything feels uncoordinated and unstable, a unifying cause lowers the anxiety dial. The brain loves causal light switches. Pull one lever, explain 10 problems, that is an emotional economy. The myth supplies budget cuts for panic. It says the chaos isn't random, and it isn't our fault. It's a schedule, a cycle, a clock we forgot to set. That alone offers rest. There's an unsettling angle to that comfort. If the appeal is psychological, then our attraction to Nibiru might reveal more about us than about the sky. We would rather believe in one grand hazard than admit to 1,000 brittle systems failing at different speeds. A cosmic culprit is tidy, a patchwork of fragile grids, food webs, currencies, alliances, and code stacks is not. The myth takes that tangle and threads it onto one line. Pull the line and the world unravels. Easy to explain, easy to tell, easier to accept. Look at what the story does to modern stressors. A market crash becomes a tide pulled by a distant mass. A heat wave turns into a symptom of periodic celestial forcing. A constitutional crisis shrinks to something like barometric pressure before a storm. Tech layoffs feel like quakes before a pass. Data breaches, satellite failures, weird auroras, grid flickers, supply chain choke points. Roll them together and call it approach. The narrative runs all wires back to a single breaker. That makes an unmanageable pile seem like a system with inputs and outputs. Here's why it hits deeper than stress management. The science story we grew up with is austere. Life emerges on a pale rock because chemistry wandered into a good valley. No guidance, no goal. You get purpose by making it. That works for some. For many, it leaves a spiritual vacuum. The ANUNNAKI frame, not judged here for accuracy, just for effect, fills that vacuum with intent. Even if humans are employees in that script, not heirs, the role is assigned, not accidental. Origin becomes decision, not drift. The universe, once indifferent, gains a ledger. That's the paradox of significance. A narrative that casts humanity as engineered labour still feels like a promotion from cosmic orphan. It binds us to a family tree. Messy as it may be, you can resent the ancestors and still feel claimed. Meaning breaks through as duty, heritage, grievance, or mission. Any of those beats, cold chance. This is the emotional engine that keeps a story alive across centuries, even when arguments about translation stall. Layer on the secret knowledge dynamic. In older currents of thought, salvation comes through insight, not institution. A hidden structure governs the visible world, and the few who see it aren't just informed. They are transformed by that, seeing Nibiru maps neatly onto that hunger. The claim isn't only that a body returns, but that awareness of its return separates the awake from the asleep. Believers move from audience to actors. They decode symbols, track alignments, and share warnings. The act of knowing becomes a rite. That rite builds a tribe. Tribes need enemies and gates. The story obliges. Gatekeepers in labs and agencies become the wardens of a false consensus. Paper trails and redactions turn into ritual signs of the veil. Every closed dataset, every failed grant, every clipped press briefing plays the role of a guardian at the threshold. The more closed doors you tally, the more credentialed your feeling of initiation. This isn't logic, it's liturgy. It works because it meets a social need, belonging under pressure. There's also the cosmic stakes problem. If the universe is full of stars and yet quiet, something interrupts. One candidate is inside us, civilizations self-destruct. Another is outside, cycles bigger than us reset the board. The Nibiru frame slots into that second slot. A long-period intruder arrives on a schedule, pushing the reset button before species master distance that concentrates purpose for those who accept it. Survive the cycle, build beyond it. Suddenly preparedness isn't paranoia, it's strategy against a test the cosmos sets for every culture that climbs. This lends urgency to ordinary choices. Food storage becomes more than thrift. Radio skills become inheritance. Off-grid power feels like literacy. Star charts become calendars of fate. The mundane world gets re-enchanted without turning whimsical. Every practice links to a larger passage. That link raises morale under uncertainty. It reduces the sense of drift. Then you reach the memory question. Stories with striking overlap appear across eras and continents. You can say that's diffusion. You can say humans share a storytelling grammar. You can also ask whether trauma writes long. Herds learn routes, species learn dangers. Cultures encode weather patterns in proverbs. It's not a leap to think sky traumas could be archived in metaphor and rite. If so, the myth might be a kind of safety deposit box. The details blur, but the warning persists. Something returns. Prepare the young. That possibility reshapes the debate. If myths carry data in symbolic wrappers, the standard fight, literal planet or poetic allegory, misses the target. The payload could be neither and both. Ritual scenes preserve observational patterns. Deity names preserve orbital roles. Catastrophe epics preserve sequences. Redness, winds, tilting, water, famine. Dark memory doesn't care about modern taxonomy. It cares about retention and transmission. Viewed that way, the story's apparent elasticity, planet, star, destroyer, messenger, becomes a feature elasticity keeps it alive. All of this says something more private. The myth functions as a coping tool in a high-noise age. It distributes accountability outward when personal agency feels thin. That's not always escapist. For some, it buys time to plan, save and build. For others, it offers absolution from action. If a cycle dictates events, why struggle? The same narrative powers opposite behaviours. That dual capacity is rare and explains reach. Different temperaments find a way to plug in. There's also the hope thread people miss when they focus on doom. A cycle implies rhythm. Rhythms include dawn. If collapse is scheduled, so is renewal. Nibiru's darker telling still contains a second arc. After the pass, new orders rise. The belief doesn't only depress, it can energize. Communities seed archives, plant seeds, teach crafts, write manuals, preserve languages, digitize libraries, and move knowledge across borders. Seen this way, the myth doesn't end the world, it keeps a lamp lit between eras. You can also read the myth as a protest. When institutions won't admit fragility, a story that names a larger force says the quiet part out loud. It bypasses corporate talking points and bureaucratic calm. It says systems can fail soon and badly. For many, that directness feels honest. It earns trust where official speech sounds padded. Myth competes with briefings because it addresses fear without euphemism and offers an arc that individuals can enter. Still, there's a cost when a single frame eats everything. If every fire, election, illness, and glitch is the approach, you stop checking for leaky wires and bad code. The world needs local fixes, not just cosmic metaphors. So the mature stance keeps the frame but refuses to let it swallow the toolbox. Use the story to motivate, not to blind. Let it organise attention without replacing investigation. That balance is harder than choosing sides, and that's why few manage it. The deeper pull remains this. Nibiru names transformation. It sees the ground under our feet is temporary, and the arc we ride is larger than the news cycle. Whether the cause is celestial, social, or personal, the sense of an incoming pivot feels real. People reach for a sky anchor because it makes private change feel like part of a wider tide loss and renewal gain context. Grief sits next to a cosmic calendar and feels less solitary. So the legend keeps reflecting us back to ourselves. When we search the clay and scan the dark, the questions that matter most aren't about orbital inclination. They are about meaning under pressure, agency under threat, community under strain. We are testing whether our species can hold a story big enough to contain dread without surrendering to it. If the myth helps do that, even imperfectly, it serves a function as old as ritual and as current as code. That's why the name survives storms of debunking and waves of belief. It operates in the gap between what we can prove and what we need to feel to carry on. It speaks to the human habit of drawing constellations between distant points, then sailing by them. We're not wrong to do it, we're built to. The risk is mistaking the map for the terrain. The reward is the courage to keep moving when the horizon looks empty. In the end, Nibiru works as a compass for moods we can't graph. It routes fear into preparation, skepticism into inquiry, loneliness into fellowship, and chaos into story. That's why it endures through new data and old doubts. It doesn't just aim at the sky, it points at the part of us that wants coherence and belonging more than we want correctness. We chase it across languages and epochs because it answers a need no telescope can measure, which means the search was always double. While we plot orbits and argue translations, we are also hunting a position for ourselves, something like a stable path between fate and freedom. We tilt the lens one way and the object looks close, tilt it another and we see our own outline in the glass. The cosmos might be stranger than either science or myth allows, but the pull we feel has a familiar source. It's the same urge that named stars, told campfire warnings, wrote epics, and built observatories. It hasn't faded. It just found a new word to carry it forward.